So the participants
Hmm.
will wait a few minutes until all the participants have
Yeah.
a chance to join.
You want to get to 500 participants before we begin?
Participants is the goal. 526.
Is that a special number?
Absolutely.
That's is it a multiple of 17? I'd have to calculate.
Bring in someone from the audience. Okay, so all of us are visible to the participants. It's a very one-way voyeuristic experience. The meeting is being transcribed.
Really?
Oh, wow.
I think Zoom does that automatically. He's been doing it. Maybe he's doing it better now. But
Okay.
Okay.
Hannes, let me know when there's a sufficient number of attendees.
I think we should start now.
Okay, good morning in Charlottesville or in Boston. Good evening in China. Good afternoon in Bulgaria. Ladies and gentlemen, the ladies are in the hidden audience. My name is Žarko Minkov, professor of philosophy at Roosevelt University. And on behalf of the Leo Strauss Foundation, I welcome you to our panel. I don't think Strauss had Zoom. I don't know if he would have liked to see us discussing his work on Zoom. I think probably. I know he refers to tape recorders and mysterious telephone. So he was not altogether averse to technology. So a large part of the mission of the Strauss Foundation is to curate and publish the papers of Strauss, including his remarkable notebooks on Maimonides, Plato's Statesman, Strauss's most difficult course, by the way, Infinite Insights into the Nature of Philosophy, Descartes' Discourse, Joseph Albel's Roots, and so on. And we have started here together with Hannes Kerber with the Youth of Rho. There's a dedicated series at Penn State for which Hannes and I are general editors. The foundation also supports the printing of other Strauss publications. There's a forthcoming one at St. Augustine Press, 500 pages of pure Strauss, things he published in English but never collected, that I am co-editing with Stephen Lenzner, and volume at SUNY Press on Strauss on Religion, co-editing with Rasoul Namazi here, as well as wonderfully rich correspondence with his brother-in-law, Paul Krauss, many collaborators on that, and with his student, Seth Benedetti. Main collaborator there is Ronna Burger. But we also support conversations like this one, and now and in the future. And I now defer to Hannes Kerber, visiting professor at the University of Modena and Reggio, Emilia, who will introduce the speakers and discussants and describe our way of proceeding.
Yeah, welcome from my end as well. I'm very happy that we're doing this. I think the title and the idea explains itself. Future themes in Leo Strauss studies, an international panel. Maybe one remark, future themes are not necessarily new themes, even though today we will get a couple of very interesting new approaches to Strauss, and we'll get to discuss them. But we will also get some evergreens and sort of classical themes and new, I think, original takes on older themes, or not necessarily new themes. Let me, one word about the way we proceed. Each of the speakers will present in 10 to 15 minutes his theme, and then the panel will discuss this theme in another 10 to 15 minutes, so that we have roughly half-hour blocks You from the audience should feel perfectly free to send us your questions through the chat. We will try to take them into account, but we can't necessarily promise that we will do that. At the end, there should be some time left for questions from the audience, but I think we've all been to events with academics, and we know that academics are prone to sometimes stretch the meaning of time. So with that being said, let me briefly introduce the participants in order of appearance. The first speaker is Eric Buzzetti. Eric is an associate professor of political science at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. His primary field of expertise is classical political philosophy. He's the author of an excellent book on Xenophon, Xenophon's Socratic Prince, Xenophon the Socratic Prince, apologies, and most recently of an essay entitled The Crisis of the West and Strauss on Xenophon. This essay is explicitly labeled as the prologue of his current research project, a book-length study of Strauss's rediscovery of political philosophy, of the political philosophy of Xenophon. And in addition to that, Eric is the co-editor, together with Devin Stauffer, of a forthcoming collection of essays by Christopher Bruhl, apologies. In 2022, in 2020, Eric brings me leads me to all kinds of blunders. In 2020, during the first stretch of the pandemic, Eric was a Karl Friedrich von Siemens Fellow at the Karl Friedrich von Siemens Stiftung in Munich, Germany, and we look forward to his presentation. The next speaker is Alexis Carré. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the program on constitutional government at the infamous and famous Harvard University. Alexis obtained his PhD under the supervision of Jean-Claude Menon at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, with a yet-to-be-published dissertation entitled War and Law, the Refounding of Liberalism Against the Conservative Revolution in Leo Strauss and Raymond Aron, for which he also received the 2021 Raymond Aron Prize. In addition to that, Alexis is also a contributor to the Review of History of European Ideas, Commentaire, Gillette, Le Figaro, and various other outlets. So you see his name in print or in digital ink in many places. Our third speaker will be Marco Menon. Marco holds a PhD in philosophy from Ca' Foscari University in Venice, Italy, and he currently teaches in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Swiss Italy in Lugano, or Italian Switzerland, as some people might want to call it. His research primarily focuses on themes related to media ethics on the one hand and political philosophy on the other. This is very well illustrated by his two books. His latest book is on the Czech philosopher Wilhelm Flusser, and the one before that is a detailed study of Strauss's Socrates and Aristophanes, which, unfortunately, I might add, is so far only available to those of us who speak Italian or read Italian. And he has also translated and edited many works by Karl Menger, Leo Strauss, Robert Pippin, and Heinrich Meyer. Our fourth distinguished speaker is Rasoul Namazi. Rasoul is an assistant professor of political theory at Duke Kunshan University in China. Rasoul holds a PhD in political theory. His research is focused on the comparative study of Islamic and Western political thought. Rasoul's latest book is titled Leo Strauss and Islamic Political Thought, and was published in 2022, I think, with Cambridge University Press. For this, he just received the Delbert Winthrop Prize for Excellence in Political Science, a very well deserved distinction. And his second book, which Zarko already mentioned, is Leo Strauss on Religion, and that is forthcoming with Zuni Press. And our fifth and last speaker is Alex Prio. Alex is teaching assistant professor at the University of Colorado and will be joining the University of Austin this fall as an associate professor of political theory. Alex has written 3 excellent books. The first one is called Becoming Socrates, Political Philosophy in Plato's Parmenides. The second one is called Defending Socrates, Political Philosophy Before the Tribunal of Science. And the third one is Musings on Plato's Symposium, apologies. And he's also written a number of essays on Plato and pre-Socratic philosophy. With that being said, we'll hand over this panel to Eric. Eric, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannes, for this generous introduction. So my topic today, this conference is devoted to the future themes in Leo Strauss studies, but I'm not going to discuss a new theme, but really possible future treatments of a very old theme in Strauss, arguably the oldest theme in Strauss, namely the theological-political problem. Now, at the outset, one might want to ask what even is the theological-political problem. That would require for its clarification an entire conference. But for my purposes, I will say briefly that I mean by this simply the question of whether the philosophic life can give an adequate justification of itself, of its own doings. Can it give an account of the right and of the necessity of philosophy? In other words, can philosophy justify the life of autonomous insight over and against the challenge that Strauss thought is posed by biblical revelation, according to which what is needed is not autonomous insight, but divine guidance? So this alternative, in short, human guidance on the basis of human knowledge or divine guidance? Now, the question I pose is a simple one. Where does Strauss end up on this question? Now, the question is central to his work. I mean, no one who has studied Strauss, I think, will deny, and I think few people also will deny that the general tendency of his thought is an attempt to solve the problem in favor of philosophy. But did he solve it in fact? Did he think that he had solved it? And if so, how exactly? And to the extent that he did not, and did not think that he had, what is the significance or the bearing of this failure, quote unquote failure, on the issue of the viability or the defensibility of philosophy as a way of life? Now, it's easy, if we turn to Strauss's works, to find passages where Strauss stresses just the gravity of this issue. I'll just mention one passage in Natural Right and History, page 75 of Natural Right and History. The context is Strauss taking a look at the historical struggle between philosophy and revelation, or philosophy and theology, and he is suggesting that it looks at first, initially at least, that neither side has ever really succeeded in refuting the other. And therefore, that means that philosophy in particular has to grant that revelation is at least possible. But then he just goes on to say, well, what's the significance of that conclusion? And I just read a couple of lines from page 75. Strauss writes, "To grant that revelation is possible means to grant that the philosophic life is not necessarily, not evidently the right life. Philosophy, the life devoted to the quest for evident knowledge available to man as man, would itself rest on an unevident, arbitrary, or blind decision." End of quote. Now, it seems to me that a passage like this, and there are other such passages in Strauss that one could bring up, sets up an extraordinarily high standard. Any granting of the possibility, the mere possibility of revelation, any failure to achieve what one might call perhaps a geometric refutation of revelation, entails that somehow philosophy is unjustifiable, that it is itself perhaps an arbitrary decision, that it is based upon faith, or is a kind of an act of faith, as Strauss puts it in other passages. And this opens up the possibility that philosophy might eventually self-destruct. Reason self-destructs when it comes to realize that it is a kind of form of faith that is ignorant of itself. All right, so the problem is clear. And I raise the question, if we look at the current state of Strauss scholarship on the question, What does it tell us about Strauss' treatment of this issue? Now, and I'm going to paint here with a very broad brush, but it seems to me that among those people who think that Strauss sought to solve the theological political problem in favor of philosophy, and perhaps that he had a solution, that one can identify two schools of thought. One, the first one, I would call the Boston College, Texas school of thought, and the other, with some degree of license, I would call the Chicago, Munich school. Now, to give a brief outline of where each of these schools stands, the first school, the BC Texas school, ascribes to Strauss the following reasoning or line of thinking. It suggests that Strauss takes his bearing by ancient thought, and especially by the Socratic investigation of virtue, or of the question, what is justice? It ascribes to Strauss the thought or the school posits that piety or religious experience has a fundamentally moral root, that faith or belief in God is the expression or the consequence of certain erroneous opinions on the plane of morality, of certain moral confusions. And if these confusions were to be removed or replaced by knowledge, presumably through an adequate analysis, then religious experience might be expected to wither away, to disappear, or to be reinterpreted. In other words, the argument here is that the most important evidence in favor of the existence of God or the gods, namely religious experience of the believer, can be shown to have a purely human root and to be no real evidence at all. And such a proof would be achieved through conversations, through dialectics, to use the Socratic term, for which, of course, Socrates was famous. Now, the second school, the Chicago-Munich school, focuses or ascribes to Strauss the following line of thought. It focuses not so much on the question, what is justice, but on the question, what is God, or what is a God? Strauss is said to have found a solution to the theological-political problem through what is called natural theology. But we have to be careful here. Natural theology here does not mean, as it traditionally or often means, it does not mean the proof of God's existence on the basis of a reflection of the order of created nature. It means rather something like the opposite, that an attempt is made to refute God, or rather to question the notion of divine providence on the basis of a reflection on the nature of God as a perfect being. What does God need to be like if he is to be perfect? For whatever God is, as Strauss puts it in one passage, it's hard to avoid the assumption that he must be a perfect being. In other words, the argument here is based on an analogy from human perfection. An attempt is made to show that certain qualities that are traditionally ascribed to God are incompatible with the perfection of God as a perfect being. And just here to illustrate, but without giving an exhaustive account of this approach, one might argue, for example, that on the human plane, there is an incompatibility between knowledge and the willingness to rule. A case in point here might be Socrates, who of course never ruled a day in his life. Or think of Plato's Republic, the philosophers in Plato's Republic who are said to be unwilling to rule, and whose unwillingness to rule is connected with the fact that they are knowers. Could we then not infer from this that the omniscience that belongs to God as a perfect being is perhaps incompatible with divine providence? Stated differently, to rule is to serve. And it seems contrary to nature that the higher being, a more perfect being, would serve the lower being. Now, as I said, this is obviously not an adequate account of the approach, but it gives you a sense of what is being attempted here. Now, I want to argue that these two schools, it seems to me that there is in Strauss evidence for both of these schools. With regard to the first school, one does find in Strauss a linking of piety with moral opinion or with moral experience. Perhaps most famously at the end of the Kuzari article, Strauss says very explicitly, or suggests very explicitly, and these are his words, that moral man as such is the potential believer. He says that explicitly, and that's not the only place. Now, as for the second school, the question, what is God, it seems to me, is stated by Strauss in several places, and perhaps most notably at the end of the very important book, City and Man, where Strauss writes that this question is, quote unquote, all important and coeval with philosophy. In other words, you cannot be a philosopher without raising this question, and one could suppose that the necessity of raising it is connected with the necessity of establishing the legitimacy of philosophy. So there is evidence in Strauss for both of these approaches. But I want to argue that neither of these approaches seems completely satisfactory. With regard to the first school, I would say this. I cannot think of though Strauss links morality with piety in several places, I cannot think of a single passage in all of Strauss where he links explicitly and unambiguously the Socratic raising of the question, what is virtue, what is justice, links it to an anti-theological goal. I don't think that's said anywhere. Now, that's not necessarily decisive, but it is unsettling for those who take this approach. Strauss was a cautious man, but nevertheless. As for the second approach, natural theology, now here's the difficulty, it seems to me, is somewhat different. Strauss does discuss natural theology in the sense that I've discussed it explicitly in several places, in Progress or Return, in particular that series of lectures. It discussed natural theology as a form of critique of the Bible. Problem is, he says, or at least he appears to say, that the approach is inadequate. Man, he says or suggests, cannot achieve knowledge of the nature of God. Whatever we can know of human perfection, that knowledge cannot legitimately be applied to divine perfection. Or as he puts it, God's perfection implies that he is incomprehensible, mysterious. Natural theology runs aground, in other words, on the problem of divine mysteriousness. God's ways may seem to be foolish to man, does not mean that they are in fact foolish. All right. So it seems to me that this difficulty, I mean, I'd love to be enlightened as to how we get around this difficulty so that the natural theology approach can be adequate. I don't know how one gets around it. Now, in light of this state of, you could say, the state of scholarship, I suggest that a turn to Strauss' work on Xenophon, especially the work of those late years of the 1970s, would be interesting. And I mean here especially his treatment of the Oeconomicus, what he regards as the most important dialogue of Xenophon. Now, the Oeconomicus is a conversation, depicts a conversation between Socrates and a perfect gentleman called Ischomicus on a subject, and seemingly pedestrian subject of household management. Ischomicus is described emphatically as perfect gentleman. And he proves to be, this individual, to be two things at once. On the one hand, to be a human being whose entire horizon is defined by law, by the moral perspective, on the one hand. And on the other, he proves to be also a model of piety. And so it seems to me that if there is an essential connection between morality and piety of the sort I've been briefly discussing, we would expect Strauss' exploration of that connection and to be found in that book. And I do think that there is evidence that that is in fact taking place. So this is with respect to the first school. Now, the more controversial part of my suggestion is with respect to the second school. It seems to me that the Oeconomicus also has a bearing on the question of natural theology. If I read Strauss's treatment of the Oeconomicus correctly, it contains the Xenophonic treatment of Socrates' natural theology. In other words, and this is the controversial part, somehow it would appear that Strauss thought that to raise the question, what is a gentleman, is somehow a way to raise the question, what is God? After all, the gentleman is repeatedly called perfect. He is a perfect gentleman, is nearly universally regarded as perfect. And so to discover what a perfect gentleman is, which is the goal of Socrates in that dialogue, is somehow arguably to gain a glimpse of what a simply perfect being would be like. And so I suggest that in a way, both of these schools somehow find a basis for their approaches in this dialogue. And I want to raise finally this final difficulty. that we're presented with a situation where we have both these schools, but no one has yet explained how these two schools are related to one another, how these two approaches are related to one another. Are they just two separate approaches, like separate arrows in a quiver of arrows? Or are they somehow connected? And perhaps in the discussion period, I may mention why I think they might be connected. And insofar as the two approaches are connected, it seems to me that the Oeconomicus would provide us with perhaps insight as to that connection. Now, how much time do I have left? I realize I didn't time myself. Am I good, or should I?
I think you're very close to the end.
Okay, very close to the end. So let me just conclude, therefore, and say this, that I go back to my initial point, that Strauss demands something like initially seems to demand something like a geometric demonstration or refutation of revelation. If we have time in the question period, I would refer us to it. Perhaps we could put on the table this discussion about the 1946 Shipwreck of Strauss, where Strauss indicates in a letter to Carl Lewis that he's become very dissatisfied with his work, and he feels the need to start again from the beginning. And I think properly understood, the Shipwreck stems from Strauss' realization that whatever solution to the theological political problem he achieved in the 30s, early 40s, he has come to doubt that solution is adequate. And I would raise the question, well, first of all, did Strauss come out of the shipwreck eventually? If so, how? And most importantly, it seems to me, if one examines the documents that are connected with this shipwreck, one discovers that not only that Strauss, I think, thought that the possibility of revelation remains open. I think at the end of the day, he does not think that this possibility can be discarded. In my question, I end with this: where does that leave the status of philosophy for Strauss as a way of life? How can the right and the necessity of philosophy be justified if, as is indeed the case, the possibility of revelation has to be granted? That's it. Thank you.
Have a discussion.
And I mean, the other panelists are right now sort of writing out their very ambitious answers. So I will just ask a simple question.
Yeah.
And from your brief account and from my recollection of Strauss's interpretation of the Oeconomicus, there's a possible sort of simple minded and simple answer to the question how the two approaches could be connected, right? I mean, to give a full account of what it could possibly mean to understand God as a perfect being, you have to understand what human perfection, what the best instance of a perfect being is that we know of. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it would mean in a way that the BCUT approach were in service of the UFC Munich. I mean, I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily a position, but I'm just asking sort of that is a
I mean, for sure, to ask the question what go ahead. To ask the question what is human perfection, one would have to then, I mean, the way Strauss presents it, the perfect gentleman is nearly universally regarded as the model of that's what it means to be a good human being. And therefore, one has to explore that. Is that the case? And Strauss's exploration of that, or Xenophon's exploration of that, brings out that there's some grave limitations in connection with the gentleman. And some of those limitations are connected with this human being's conception of the moral laws. So yes, I think that's true to that extent. I accept that. And therefore, in other words, we can't take for granted that human perfection means theoretical perfection or philosophy. You know, the starting point is moral, not philosophic or theoretical. On the other hand, I hesitate a little bit to simply accept. I mean, I don't want to get too technical. Most people in the audience probably have never read the Oeconomicus. But there is a moment in the dialogue where the discussion, what I take to be the discussion of the question, what is God, occurs, it seems to me, in the part of the conversation that takes place after Socrates has indicated that he's gotten the essential of what he needs from his conversation with this fellow Oeconomicus. He's ready to leave, and for secondary reasons, the conversation continues. And this is when the most important section of the dialogue for the question of natural theology takes place. So that suggests to me a certain that there's something playful about the treatment of the question, what is God, in that dialogue, at least. Now, I realize the question is in itself not playful, but nevertheless, in that dialogue, I think there's something playful about the treatment.
Yeah, just jumping very quickly, you seem to think that the approach via the comparison to the gentleman might work, but you said that God can be absolutely mysterious, so that immediately
this is Strauss, what Strauss says.
Yeah, but then a few minutes later, then you said, but I have another suggestion. Maybe it's addressed via the gentleman, or were you just repeating the earlier approach?
No, I was just repeating. Yeah, I was just repeating. Repeating the earlier. It's not that those two approaches find a basis, or there's some textual basis for these two approaches. I do believe that both are found in Strauss. I question the adequacy of either, and whether Strauss himself regarded either as adequate. You know, it's just, when you read Strauss, he does insist on the importance ultimately of a refutation of revelation, but it's not, I mean, again, these are harsh things to say in public, but it's not at all clear that he thought that's possible. And then where does that leave philosophy? Because there are many statements in Strauss that says, unless you have that, philosophy is the meaning of philosophy becomes radically questionable. You know, maybe it's totally unimportant. Something else is more important.
Okay, this is just a technical question then, because the Oeconomicus was written in the 70s, late 60s, right? Not Xenophon.
Yeah, published in 70. Yeah.
And but the so-called Shipwreck was in the 40s.
Yeah.
Now there is another book on Xenophon that he wrote in the 40s also.
Yeah, on tyranny. Yeah.
Because these notes on the Shipwreck are usually associated with Kierkegaard and Pascal, and maybe Maimonides is the way out or some.
Yeah.
But not Xenophon. Xenophon is usually not. Yeah. But he was writing. I guess he wrote this book right around the time of the so-called Shipwreck. So do you?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, the Shipwreck, if you read the documents connected with the Shipwreck, Strauss seems to have thought at that point that the first step was to make clear to himself what, on the one hand, the idea of philosophy is, and on the other hand, articulate more clearly what revelation is. That somehow, to even approach the question adequately, one had to articulate those two things more adequately than he had done up to that point. And I think the On Tyranny book is an attempt at articulating more fully the idea of philosophy. I think that's what he's doing there. It's not sufficient for that task, but it's the beginning of his carrying out that task. And at the end of the On Tyranny, the last chapter on tyranny, that chapter is entitled on piety and law. So the two notions are connected explicitly in the title. So this lends at least some support for the first of the schools that I mentioned. But in that same chapter, in a footnote, there's a reference to Simonides, the poet Simonides, who was asked by the tyrant Hiero the question, what is God? And he proved to be unable to answer this question. And although Strauss does not mention it in that footnote, if you look up the passage in Cicero, you find that Simonides, as a result of his inability to answer this question, came to doubt, to despair of knowledge as such. And so, in other words, you see here what is at stake, that unless you answer the question, any orientation by knowledge in the world becomes problematic. Right.
Alex, you go.
Thanks, Eric. That was really helpful and clarifying of a lot of things. One question. So at the end of the City of the Man, you get the quid sit deus remark. And then Strauss publishes Socrates and Aristophanes, and in the chapter on the birds, there's some interesting theological remarks there in connection with the symposium. And in the symposium course, which he thought of publishing, the transcript during his life, there's also some interesting theological remarks. And then, of course, the Lucretius essay in Liberalism in Ancient and Modern. So I'm persuaded that the Oeconomicus would fit into as part of a general sort of strategy, thinking about morality and thinking about theology in all of these works and courses. Do you have any sense of a development in his theological thinking over this work, or how these things connect? Because it does seem like the Oeconomicus, if you're going to bring that into the fold, you'd want to fit it into some kind of narrative of sort of post thoughts on Machiavelli, Strauss,
Yeah.
So
I tend to regard the Aristophanes book and the two Xenophon books, they, in some ways, I think they form a whole. And I would say, and one sign of this, I mean, liberalism ancient and moderns is, which comes in between, is a bit of a different case because that's a collection of essays, but the books that were written as books, those three seem to belong together. And if you just look at the introduction to Socrates and Aristophanes on the one hand, and the introduction to the first of the Xenophon books, they're remarkably similar, and so that's already a sign that they belong together. And I would, and if I read them correctly, if you read the preface to the Socrates and Aristophanes book, he raises the question of the relation between art and science, or between beauty and truth. And it seems to me that if you just follow this question, not just through in the Aristophanes and Socrates book, but also in the Xenophon books, that's what unites those three books, that the treatment of that theme, the relation between art and science, or between beauty and truth. Now, these are perhaps enigmatic remarks. I'm very mindful of the time, but I think that provides an opening wedge into the meaning of those books. Is there a development, you asked? I don't see that, but I would describe it more as a kind of exploration of the complexity of the question, and especially so. But I don't see a development or kind of a advance that I don't see. It seems to me that's not there. The real turning point is the shipwreck, but after that, I don't see a development.
Alexis, it's your turn, and maybe, I mean, if there's a brief question after your question, we could sneak that in, but otherwise we should move. But take your time for the answer and the question.
So thank you. That was incredibly insightful. I had one question on the two approaches. You drew the example about the second approach, that it was contradictory with the concept of God to serve, or to the concept of a perfect being. It immediately came to my mind that it's also a characteristic of the gentleman that he prefers to serve than to be useful. So to make sense of that quality of the providential God, we seem to be compelled to relate it to the contradictions that are internal to the figure of the gentleman himself. And so that's the example that caught my attention. But my question then is, to what extent do those two approaches merely translate in different languages similar problems, and what would you say decisively distinguishes them? And then both of them seem to be focused on the idea of a providential God. To what extent do the arguments that disprove the possibility of a providential God, but not the possibility of God simply, relate to your first problem, which was the impossibility of philosophy? So if you manage to disprove the providential God, does the possibility or the indifference of whether God exists as a non-providential God, how does it relate to the problem of the possibility of philosophy?
No, that's a good question, because I think the issue is much more complex than I was able to allow, because the theological-political problem is not just, you could say, a practical question, divine guidance versus human guidance, but there's also philosophy itself becomes problematic, not just because you run the risk of, going to hell, so to speak, but insofar as a philosophy or science presupposes the notion of nature, that what the philosopher aims to do is to discover nature, and nature itself becomes a radically problematic notion if it is true that the world is ultimately held together not by nature, a necessary principle, but by will, by divine will. And so, and therefore, the threat is not just one of some kind of punishment after life, but also that what you're doing as a philosopher, in order to have clarity about what you're doing, you have to have some confidence that you're not simply articulating in your thought, you could say the habit of the God, so to speak. The world happens to be like this right now, but in 2 seconds it could change radically because it's ultimately held together by a principle that is not necessary, that is not eternal, but is not accidental, but it just happens to be the expression of God's will at the moment. So again, yeah, go ahead.
Third quick question. So Alex mentioned the Aristophanes book, and do you think there is a difference between the problem of theology and philosophy and the problem of philosophy and poetry? Because if you do, the poet and the theologian seem to be very different figures making fairly different claims.
Yeah.
So could you say more about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, for sure there's a difference, of course, but although there's an exploration, I suspect in the Aristophanes book of the poetic depiction of the gods, but that there might be an aspect that is not captured by my presentation. It might be the case that Strauss want to see whether there is not in the poet, as opposed to the philosopher, a clear and more adequate grasp of certain human experiences that have a close connection with the experience of piety. I'm thinking of the family, the experience of love in particular. And therefore and therefore it's the poet who really has the true ability to understand the phenomenon of religious experience. The philosopher is too narrow, so to speak. Socrates is unerotic as he's presented by Aristophanes. Now, if there's a necessary connection between eros and belief, then that does certainly suggest that Socrates is not the person you want to turn to understand the phenomenon of religious belief.
Thank you.
Let me leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. With that being said, thank you very much, Eric, for the presentation and the discussion. I mean, as goes without saying, we will be able to come back to this later. But now we should turn to Alexis. Alexis's presentation is entitled Strauss, Schmitt, and the Political Polarity.
Thank you, Hannes. So I must confess that I was embarrassed at first to find something to talk about as part of this meeting. The object of the present event is to discuss future themes in Straussian studies, which I understood, as Hannes corrected us in the beginning, mistakenly as new themes in Straussian studies. And it is difficult indeed a difficult task to set oneself to in the case of an author who can allegedly be said to have claimed he had nothing new and unheard of to teach us. As what he attempted was not the creation of some new concepts, the founding of new modes and orders, but simply a recovery of ancient political philosophy. However, beautiful things are indeed difficult, and surely such a task would require the best minds. If I look around, with the exception of myself, I suddenly am reassured that I will learn something new. Maybe because he wasn't French, Strauss could be caught being humble without raising suspicion, for indeed my colleagues here will immediately call out my bad faith or my obtusity in making the present task appear more difficult than it actually is. There are, of course, many ways of understanding the adjective future or new that do not conflict with that aspect of Strauss I just described. There could be nothing new in Strauss and still new themes in Straussian studies. For example, corrections of misunderstandings in the body of works by which others tried to make sense of his enterprise. There could be things that Strauss left us to discover in his work that are still in mind, new sources to, or new interpretations of ones we already have access to. More importantly, what is recovery, if not the fact of knowing something anew? At last, there could be new ways to make use of existing and presumably correct interpretations in relation to our present situation. All things, in other words, that are new for us, if not new simply. As my delaying tactic has served its purpose, I have now enough time to present how little I have to say about the actual topic of my intervention, the Strauss, Carl Schmitt, and the political polarity. The things I'm going to say may not be new to you, in which case this will be the public confession of my own ignorance. The political polarity for us today, across a wide range of Western democracies, takes the form of polarization. A somewhat static concept, polarity, around which our regime could be structured in the form of alternating parties in power, has now become a process, polarization, by which our two parties or poles sometimes seem to want to become their own country. The radical part of the progressive left no longer sees the pertinence of political pluralism and interprets the rule of the other party as an illegitimate usurpation of power, hostile to their most fundamental rights. And the radical part of the conservative right sees the other party as attempting a profound and vicious destruction of tradition, in the face of which they seek to establish the basis of an illiberal democracy. This phenomenon is rightly called polarization, as it manifests in the supporters of the two parties barely ever meeting, as they are magnetically repelled by each other. They live in different places, have different social circles, different professions and leisures. It has, in other words, manifested in the self-perception of two opposing cultures and in the war of those cultures. And since culture may be described as the totality of human thoughts and actions, their confrontation means that everything is at stake in that fight for the members of each of them. The culture war is thus commonly understood as a sign of politicization, leading to the mobilization of a rhetoric of radical enmity and extreme situation on both sides. Now, how does that relate to Strauss and Straussian studies? Well, I think it does, in the sense that political polarization seems and have been said to follow a Schmittian logic, and that Strauss, by Schmitt's own account, offered the most penetrating insight into his thought. This insight is, moreover, connected, as we all know, to Strauss's own change of orientation in the direction of a recovery of ancient political philosophy. This change of orientation, which led to the new and central theme of his thought, is left unaccounted, at least in Strauss's summary mention of it in the preface to the English translation of his book on Spinoza. Discovering a few years ago his correspondence with Gerhard Krüger at the time when he worked and published those notes offered me at least a new way to understand that change as it related not entirely by accident to Schmitt. New might be a strong term for what might just appear as an inflection to many of you. And part of what makes me think this inflection might be useful is purely contextual and accidental, and precisely lies in the current use of Schmitt in commentaries on the present political polarization. Schmitt is understood by Strauss to have confronted the problem of human order, of the order of human things, as it expressed itself in the superficial opposition of legal normativism and decisionism. Due to that opposition, practical reason seems dismembered along the lines of two possibilities that seem also to be coeval with modern political thought and illustrated in its various instantiations. Reason without concern for application, in other words, universal norms, which, if one goes so far as Kant, do not depend on situations, but not even on human nature or human history, as they apply equally to all rational beings in the universe. And then concern for application regardless of the reasons of the agent, action on the basis of necessity, as if necessity was not always for an agent. Strauss famously challenged Schmitt's decisionism by the assertion that it didn't allow him to escape the systematic of liberal thought. A fairly common interpretation is that Schmitt, after the notes, answered Strauss's challenge and effectively escaped the trap of his early decisionism in favor of a legal thought according to concrete orders. The arc of that evolution goes from three types of juristic thought in the mid-30s, shortly after the concept of the political, to the Leviathan in the state theory of Thomas Hobbes in the late 30s, where Strauss's presence is very much felt and even mentioned, to the nomos of the earth post-war. Anticipating in the notes a fairly common interpretation, Strauss denies that from Schmitt's assertion of the political derives the moral primacy of enmity or war. But my contention is that what it does reveal continues to be true of the juristic thought according to the concrete order of his later works. What the anormal situation reveals is, so to speak, the epistemological or heuristic primacy of the enemy. The fact that only through him is made visible to the member of a community the nature of the bond that unites them as obligation. Schmitt doesn't pretend that the enemy is at the origin of civic friendship. Communities do not form for the mere fact of defending themselves against the enemy, something which is already apparent in the existence or in the fact that they may have essential enemies. But by calling into question the existence of the community, the enemy concretely submits its members to the necessity of seeing what unites them, in fact and concretely already, under the form of commands. of an obligation justifying the necessity of sacrifice which the situation demands. By means of that situation, almost as a scientific experiment, Schmitt manages, so to speak, to restore or reconstruct the primacy of obligation without recourse to the command of reason, on the basis, therefore, of the undeniable and compelling reality of peril, which threatens the unity of the order. Without such a command, he is yet forced to accept all such orders as given. He cannot judge them. And sliding from the absolute moment of decision to the continuous work of a force in maintaining an order, one is still forced to derive the norm, which does exist in this case in time, as a concrete object to be studied from the anormal but juristic act of foundation. It is therefore still from within the limits of the neutral gaze of science, which he is forced to adopt as long as he maintains the belief in the impotence of reason, that Schmitt attempts to account for the demands of morality and the concern for the morally serious life, trying to bring together what his science forces him to keep separate. As a mechanic who throws away some pieces of an engine whose function will now be delegated to some other part of the vehicle, the enemy and the compelling threats he represents stands in for the absence of natural sanctions to duties that consequently Schmitt can no longer understand as natural, but attempts to maintain without the help of nature. Now let's get back to Strauss. In a letter from 1932, he says to Kruger, I believe, I'm quoting, I believe there is ultimately only one opposition, namely between left and right, freedom and authority, or pleasure and good. In opposition to agreement at any price, conflict is truer, but only peace, i.e., agreement in the truth, can be the last word. That this agreement of reason is possible, I firmly believe. End of quote. In another letter, a year later, he pursues on that same theme. Quote, I understand my option for the political right as not knowing but opining. If, however, someone believes in right ideals, he may be more suitable for all possible actions. Yet it remains the case that he merely opines and does not know. I want to claim in general that ideals are never a matter of belief, but a matter of either knowledge or opinion. To believe is to believe someone, and an ideal is not someone. Further, to believe someone that his ideal is the right one is merely to opine that his ideal is the right one. From this, we get the sense that Strauss's option for the right, as he calls it, is not a call to action, but a necessary consequence of his inquiry into the possibility of this agreement in truth, the absolutely justified command, which has to start from the conflicting opinions about what that command might be, rather than opinions that don't suppose such a command to exist, and from the belief in the philosopher or the possibility of the philosopher, who can be the sole source of such an agreement. Now, I do think Schmitt allows us to understand today's polarization, but I think he does so not by his account of politics, but by his failure to capture the distinction drawn by Strauss, which I think is also our failure when we think in polarized terms. Schmitt's reconstruction of the primacy of obligation forces him to overlook the question of the agent, of the someone, as Strauss calls them, whom we believe something about when comes the time of action, of obedience or disobedience. This failure is not particular to Schmitt, but characterizes the whole group of thinkers, later called the Conservative Revolution. It manifested in their opinion that since Western democracies claimed the ideal of freedom or pleasure, they would quickly collapse in the face of the assertion of authority and the good. They would be incapable of sacrifice. In other words, it is because they confused opinion and belief, as well as theory and action, that they could not believe such a man as Churchill could emerge, stand up to them, and win the struggle that they had wished for and initiated. In that sense, they proved themselves to be even more enthralled in the spirit of abstraction that they had blamed on Western liberalism. My contention is further that the same illusion is at work in our perception of polarization. It is because we confuse opinion and belief that we believe the members of the other party to be mortal enemies, because of their opinion rather than on the basis of an honest account of them as agents. Yet if we were being more honest, we would have to reckon with the fact that the members of those opposing groups have neither the will, nor the virtues, nor the means to inflict death upon one another. Is there a more ridiculous sight than entire societies believing themselves to be engaged or on the brink of civil war in the midst of so much comfort and security? Indeed, I will even argue that it is because such is the case that members of those groups can indulge in the seemingly warlike opinion that they profess without consequence. Polarization in that sense, far from being a sign of politicization, appears, on the contrary, as a symptom of radical depoliticization, where speech rarely has any more identifiable connection or relation to deeds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexis. While our panel, I don't see any immediate questions, so I will allow myself the first question. Oh, Eric, shoot.
No, go for it. I've spoken already a lot. Why don't you go?
Well, it's just, I mean, this question of the problem of the Schmitt's failure to raise the question of the agent is a very interesting point. And is this also where Strauss's interest in statesmanship comes back? As sort of, I'm thinking of the Burke chapter in history, for example. I mean, is this sort of the path that you would pursue? Yeah.
Yeah. So I, as you mentioned, I wrote my dissertation on Strauss and Aron, and I think part of what's interesting about Schmitt is that it draws us to this situation that seems almost like a scientific experiment, where an ocular apparatus where certain things become visible that are invisible in, you know, more normal or daily everydayness. And what is striking is that it doesn't account or see something that seems obvious in those cases for most people, which is when laws or institutions do not prescribe your conduct, your only guidance and your one you trust very spontaneously is your perception of the qualities and virtues of the people around you. Revolutionary leaders, etc., are what they are because they're perceived to be courageous, etc., etc. And so there seems to be a paradox in his drawing our attention to those situations while completely disregarding what comes to the front in those situations, which is agents and their characters, which are their only source of authority because they don't have a function in institutions and they don't have laws that grant them the legal competence or the legitimacy to command and act. And yet that command is still happening in those situations. People still obey and, you know, have concrete relations of command and obedience. So I do think it's, yeah.
Eric.
Yes, thank you, Alexis, for your presentation. Thank you very much. I wanted to know whether you could say a few things about, as you know, at the end, as you mentioned, at the end of the preface to the Spinoza book, Strauss refers to his early review of Schmitt's concept of the political and suggests that this was not a turning point, but that earlier in his early years, Strauss had thought that a return to pre-modern thought is impossible, and then he changed his mind. There was this change of orientation, and he suggests that this change of orientation found its first expression in that review, that book review that he did of the concept of the political. Could you say a bit more about what do you think is this first expression that one finds in Strauss' book review of Schmitt? How does it somehow point to the possibility of a return to the pre-modern thought, which he had denied earlier?
So, I mean, it seems to be very much tightly connected to Hobbes and to the book he published on it. So it seems to be, I mean, I might be wrong, but if you recall the end of the introduction in Natural Right and History, he frames the problem as between Aristotle and modern science as seeing modern science, natural science seems to have made Aristotle's science as a whole, including his political science, irrelevant. I think if you look at how Strauss describes his project in the Hobbes book, he seems to disconnect the problem of natural sciences from the problem of human sciences, something that already appears in his book on Spinoza, where he says, you know, you can solve the problem of physics but that leads to civil war. And so the problem of anthropology, at least for us, precedes that of the natural sciences. And he goes much further in the book on Hobbes by explicitly, I think for one of the first times, stating that the modern rupture or break with ancient philosophy as its origin in morality and the problem of morality, not in the problem of natural sciences.
Yeah. Makes sense. Can I ask a follow-up or just make a suggestion about it? That makes a lot of sense to me. I would suggest that you're right to say that according to Strauss, Schmitt is somehow yearning for a recovery of the concept of obligation, you could say. He's sort of disgusted by liberalism for its lack of moral seriousness. And Strauss, to make complicated things simple, Strauss says, in effect, you can't recover the notion of obligation on the basis of Hobbes, because Hobbes' starting point is a kind of moral neutrality, the moral neutrality of the state of nature. One has to go back to the concept of evil understood as human depravity, that is to say, immorality. That has to be the starting point. In other words, go back to, and I link your presentation to mine, go back to the concept of law, the moral law. That has to be the starting point. And I wonder if this is not, therefore, a pointer toward the reality, the importance of the focus on the moral law as, the theme that I took up, as somehow central to solving the theological political problem, that Hobbes is inadequate for its inadequate treatment of morality, and that means also that you can't solve that problem on the basis of Hobbes. That would be my suggestion. Yeah.
And in the Hobbes book, you have many mentions that seem to recall Schmitt and the problem of exception as well. Starting from Hobbes, Strauss says that one can no longer ask in situations what a wise man would have done, and that seems to be the answer in the situation where laws are silent. Situations can still be judged. It's not an empty field where any means necessary are possible, and that does point to the problem of the moral law, but I think also to the figure of the practical agent and practical wisdom. And the distinction, there is something to be learned from the agent itself. It's not just, a figure that can be informed from the outside. And I think part of what Strauss sees in Hobbes' break with ancient political philosophy is the fusion, the necessary fusion of theory and practice. So in the denial of the idea of practical wisdom. And in a way, you see that in the concept of vanity. Anything that men add to their being by words is described as an inflation. So nothing men can say about their qualities or the attributes that they add by language to their being. Nothing of that matters to political science.
We
leave it. Yeah.
Let me ask one more question. Maybe I can share this letter. I think I understand the importance of the distinction between theory and practice. This letter was, I don't know if I can show it. This, yeah, I don't know if I can share my, I have too many protectors. So I think it'd be good to share the letter. I don't know, Hannes, are you able to share the letter that Alexis put on? Well, the second letter, because it seems like, yeah, well, you're sharing that, but he quotes it he puts it in quotation marks. I think the point is different, even though he's trying to make the distinction. He's also assimilating opinion to belief. Maybe I'll just read a little bit. Kruger.
I think what he says is that every belief contains opinions. So to believe someone is to also be carried into opinions. But the problem for him is the difference between opinion and knowledge.
Yes.
And he refuses the question of action of belief, which would lead him to action. So he's is led to that distinction between I think it deals with a distinction between not only belief and opinion, but theory and practice.
Because the context is that Kruger had I think Kruger had tried to assimilate him to a believer. And said, you should say, I believe. So I don't know. We don't have the Kruger letter.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, I don't know if you can if we can pull it up. I mean, I guess it'll be easier if you have it in the English translation, but I mean, it's a long letter and it would require, and I know you're putting.
Oh yeah, that's going to be cumbersome, I think.
Yeah, I think it would take, I think at one point it says, how does faith come about? So and he goes back to Augustine. So I think he's resisting Kruger's statement. I'm just reconstructing.
Maybe that's a good discussion for a follow-up.
Yeah.
Question for a follow-up discussion. But I sort of detected a question which was not indicated by a raised hand in Alex's mind, maybe?
No, I was answering a question somebody had put in the chat. I'm listening attentively and learning.
Well, we can probably move to Marco's presentation.
If there is Rasoul, are you just no? Then we should move on, and we can always circle back to arguments that have been made. Thank you very much, Alex.
Okay, yeah. Marco Menon has a presentation on Leo Strauss as a theologian, not as a liberal theologian, but maybe liberal one. As a theologian.
I'll be right there. Thanks. In the meantime, thanks, Hannes. Thanks, Zarko. I'm trying to share my screen because I'm going to. Okay, here it is. Thanks. I assume you are seeing my text, so this is going to be useful, I guess. So before proceeding, I'd like to clarify the meaning of the title of my talk. Leo Strauss is a theologian. I don't think that Leo Strauss was a theologian, quite the opposite. Rather, I suggest considering Leo Strauss in his capacity as a theologian. Indeed, Strauss occasionally assumed the role of the theologian, giving voice to a theological perspective on philosophy. This is in many cases Strauss's own dialectical style, looking at philosophy through the lenses of theology and vice versa. Now, my question is, what kind of theologian does Strauss portray? This is the initial starting point for my discussion. Building upon this, I will outline several related questions in the rest of my talk. Together, these questions contribute to the exploration of the alternative between Jerusalem and Athens. Strauss introduces different notions of theology in various contexts throughout his work. A central but rarely occurring concept is the one of political theology, that is, a political doctrine or teaching based on divine revelation. Natural theology appears slightly more frequently. The latter, based on human reason alone, is contrasted with revealed theology, which stems from God's self-revelation to human beings. At this point, one might investigate the origins of these concepts. In fact, they cannot be taken for granted. Strauss appears to adopt and adapt them from different sources, giving them very personal interpretation. For instance, does his notion of political theology correspond to Carl Schmitt's understanding of it, or does it have a distinct genealogy, maybe closer to Eric Peterson's understanding of it? Similarly, his concept of natural theology slightly diverges from the scholastic tradition. Unlike traditional natural theology, which amounts to a rational demonstration of the existence of God, Strauss's version of the argument focuses on the nature of God, conceived as the most perfect being. His argument apparently does not address the question of existence. For example, in Reason and Revelation, Strauss develops a hypothetical natural theological argument. Perhaps it would be more accurate to term it philosophical theology to underscore the departure from the scholastic framework, as Hannes Kerber recently did. But Strauss preferred natural theology. Why did he choose that specific term? Finally, and perhaps this is the most intricate question, we need to clarify the meaning of revealed theology and more broadly of revelation in Strauss's thought and teaching. I think that the framing of the fundamental alternative between Jerusalem and Athens also partly depends on how the position of Jerusalem is understood. Strauss early on interpreted the revelation as the revelation of a divine law, a relation as Gesetzgebung, thus breaking with the experiential or subjective conception of religion. We must consider whether his concept of revelation, which seems to be tailored on the Jewish tradition, can easily also be applied to various trends within Christianity. Please let me mention just a very easy example. In Christianity, the Word of God became flesh, incarnating in a person at a specific place and time. Hence, it has been argued that the essence of Christianity is not a morality, an idea, theory, metaphysics, or social ethics. The essence of Christianity, on the contrary, is a person. It's Jesus Christ. This was explained very clearly by Romano Guardini, among others. Can the idea of divine law adopted by Strauss also include this conception? Or is it perhaps excessively normative and narrow? For many of us, these are questions that have already been extensively explored and studied. Indeed, they are recurring themes in the realm of Straussian studies on the Jerusalem and Athens topic. From this perspective, what I propose may not seem entirely novel. However, it's not the subject matter itself, but rather the perspective that I suggest altering. Hence the title Leo Strauss as a Theologian. My proposal is to reconsider all these questions within a different framework, not that of philosophy or political philosophy, where they have primarily been situated, but within the realm of theology. But which kind of theology? While there are several studies on the relationship between Strauss and Jewish thought, as well as recent studies on Strauss and Islamic thought, they propose a deeper exploration of the relationship between Strauss and Christian theology, particularly post-war German Protestant theology. The hypothesis I wish to explore is that Strauss's understanding of revelation, particularly in the initial phase of his career, was heavily influenced by Protestant neo-orthodoxy, or the so-called theology of crisis, represented by figures like Karl Barth, Friedrich Gogarten, and Henry Brunner. Gogarten and Brunner were explicitly and critically treated by Strauss. They were not radical enough, according to Strauss. Maybe from that criticism we can deduce a more precise notion of his theological position. Of course, such an investigation needs to confront itself with various stages in the development of Strauss's theological position, so to speak. I can recall at least some major shifts. Firstly, consider the significance he appeared to attribute to Calvin's theology in his initial book on Spinoza. At the time, Calvin's seemed to be the strongest theological teaching. Secondly, consider how the initial focus on the question of miracles, which was truly crucial in the books on the critique of religion in the 1930s, gradually moved into the background. Lastly, consider how the young Strauss criticized the post-Kantian experiential and subjectivist conception of religion, stemming from German idealism's reaction to the Enlightenment, aligning for a moment with the disrupting stance of neo-Orthodox theologians. Later, Strauss would embrace a more distinctly Jewish version of orthodoxy, whose core is the law. I believe it's highly pertinent to examine all those issues also from a more historical point of view. This entails a reconstruction of the theological landscape that shaped Strauss's early position, not merely by focusing on Franz Rosenzweig's new thinking or Hermann Cohen's religious teaching, but by giving greater consideration to the theology of crisis prevalent in the first half of the 20th century. Was his idea of revelation influenced by this tradition? Did such influence persist throughout his intellectual endeavors, or did he emancipate himself from it at a certain point? And again, what philosophical implications might this connection entail? Just let me point out how certain arguments or trends from the theology of crisis appear remarkably similar to those of Strauss's. For instance, the theology of crisis radically questions our mundane way of life, urging individuals to justify themselves before God. It even questions human reason as such, embracing a paradoxical view of faith. Not to mention its criticism of historicism, of the peculiarly modern notion of religion as culture, and finally its insistence on restlessness and disruption against harmony and synthesis. How deeply is Strauss entangled in this style of thought? Another historical aspect worth investigating concerns the theology after Strauss. It's undeniable that Strauss gave theology compelling arguments against modern anti-theistic and atheistic philosophy. However, were these arguments an original contribution? Were they embraced by theologians or were they disregarded? Did Strauss's theological stance exert any influence? This appears to be the case, at least within Jewish thought, as shown by the example of Emil Fackenheim. Are there other cases of similar influence, perhaps in Christian or Islamic recent trends? One last, even more puzzling difficulty worth mentioning in conclusion concerns the writings from the final decade of Strauss's philosophical career. In many cases, we encounter detailed analysis of the gods in Greek and Roman literature. Consider, for instance, Strauss's essays on Aristophanes' comedies, Lucretius' poem De Rerum Natura, or Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War. These are all commentaries wherein Strauss purportedly explores various facets of the theological-political problem. But what connection exists between this examination of the gods and revealed biblical theology? For a long time, I was convinced that Strauss was looking for philosophical arguments within Greek and Roman, that is, pre-Christian thought, to address the challenge posed by biblical revelation, a challenge that fundamentally questions the very possibility of the philosophical way of life. I've often encountered objection asserting that it's nonsensical to compare the theology of Aristophanes or Lucretius with the revealed theology of biblical origin. The distance between these two cultural realms is so vast, an abyss separating a monotheistic culture from a pagan polytheistic milieu of ancient Greece. However, I never found this objection very compelling. Indeed, Strauss himself demonstrated attempts to bridge these two worlds, as evidenced, for example, in his lecture on Plato's Euthyphro. In that commentary, as well as in other texts recently discovered and published by Svetozar, Minkov, and Hannes Kerber, Strauss unmistakably tries to apply the arguments found in the Euthyphro to biblical monotheism. I'm no longer sure if I'm right, however. Sometimes I wonder how a radical theologian like Karl Barth might have answered to arguments drawn from these philosophical or natural theologies. If we picture the most perfect being according to the analogy of the wise, maybe we are just implying the deification of the human being, thus creating a God in the image and likeness of people we consider almost perfect for some questionable reason. Barth might condemn this as idolatry, I suppose, dismissing such arguments as null and void. Moreover, I am desperately uncertain now of the relevance of theology of the theology of Xenophon, Lucretius, Aristophanes, or Thucydides in the comparison between Jerusalem and Athens. A comprehensive study of Strauss as a theologian would attempt to clarify this point. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was very thought-provoking, and I'm pleased that you documented your own shipwreck so thoroughly in front of this distinguished audience. Eric, do you have a question? Is that why you're unmuted?
No, it's because I'm sloppy.
But Rasoul has the first question.
Yes, thank you so much, Marco. Very thought-provoking text. Actually, you have addressed some of the questions that I've had for a long time in the same way that I did, meaning that I don't know the answer to them. So I just want to mention a few points. First, I completely agree with you that when he uses the term political theology or natural theology, it can be extremely confusing. Because political theology, as soon as you hear it, you think about Carl Schmitt, or you think about Varro, right? The same is Varro Augustine, I mean, yes. The same is with natural theology. So you think about these kind of things, but this is not actually what he means at all. It seems, at least to me, whenever he uses these terms, he's on another plane. Especially when he talks about natural theology, for a while, it was very confusing for me because I couldn't understand what does it have to do with natural theology that we understand in general. So that's one point, and I would like to know if you can develop this idea, meaning what is the relationship between Carl Schmitt, Varro, and Strauss, and these kind of definitions? The other point that comes to my mind is, you're absolutely right again, when he talks about religion, he has mostly in mind Judaism or Islam. And it has been said before, right? This idea, Remy Bragg mentions this, that his understanding of religion is really Judaism and Islam. It's not really Christianity. It doesn't seem to be, because it's very law-centered. And he seems to actually prefer this kind of religions because he thinks, at least at the end of his career, he thinks that they pose more challenges to philosophy and they are much more fruitful for understanding philosophy rather than Christianity. And I'm thankful to you for reminding us that at first it was not like that, meaning it seems that in his book on Spinoza, he has Christianity mostly in mind, not Judaism or Islam. So just these 2 points. You mentioned something about whether it has had any impact on Islam or not. Perhaps I will talk about it later on. That's not very important anyway. But I would like to know what you think about especially the first point. Thank you.
Shall I answer now, or are we waiting for another round of questions?
No, you should answer. I have a question for both you and Rasoul, but I first want to hear your answer. So, yes, please do.
So thanks. As regards the appropriation by Leo Strauss of concepts such as political theology or natural theology, I don't have a clear answer, but I can at least try to articulate the problem. I mean, when Strauss mentions political theology, he intends a very specific notion. We know that it comes to mind directly Carl Schmitt. So I guess we need to dig a little bit to understand who was he talking to in the What is Political Philosophy lessons. Did he have somebody in mind? Maybe Buber was there. I don't know. So we need to address those problems, because I guess that What is Political Philosophy, just at least at the beginning, has a very rhetorical, powerful aspect. So maybe there are hints. But as regard your question, I guess I have more to say about natural theology, because the issue concerning political theology on my part is mostly on historical issues. So we need to dig deeper to see whether he had connection with, I don't know, maybe read Eric Patterson's, or I don't know. But as regard natural theology, I noticed yesterday, thanks to Svetozar Minkov, who sent me an excerpt from a transcript, that Strauss used the term philosophical theology. So the problem is, of course, that was a point that already Eric Buzzetti mentioned before. When we think of natural theology, the first thing that comes to my mind, given my background, it's Aquinas, the 5 ways to demonstrate or Anselm. So rational arguments to show that it's reasonable to think of a most perfect being, and it's necessary that it exists. So that kind of thing. But Strauss uses natural theology to articulate, let's say, a theory of attributes. I don't know if this is the correct way to put it. And then it very much focuses on the wisdom, the analogy of the wise man. So I have not been able to trace this kind of natural theology to any author I know. So I guess, I don't know, maybe it has something to do with Maimonides, with And I'm not very familiar with Maimonides, so I don't know if that's a good path. I don't know. But still, I've noticed lately, and I was provoked by this by Wayne Ambler, who questioned me about that. So I would like to thank Wayne Ambler. I don't know if you are out there, but thanks for that. Was a very thought-provoking question you made. And I noticed that there is a passage where Strauss, in one of the two places where he mentioned natural theology, that he speaks of natural theology as an argument which has a philosophical aspect. So I wonder, is there a non-philosophical aspect to natural theology? So maybe, and this is those are not answers, those are more questions. I have a proposal, if you wish. Maybe natural theology, just like natural right or political philosophy, is an invention of Strauss. So the way in which he frames political philosophy, classical political philosophy, sorry, I meant classical political philosophy, and then natural right. Nobody spoke of natural right before Strauss in that way, that there was natural law and such things. So this is why it's very sleepy when you speak of natural right. Still, many scholars get natural law. So this is very confusing, and I guess part of his strategy, I don't know, regards also natural theology. This is my proposal. So I want to know what you think, because I'm truly puzzled. So when Hannes mentioned my Shipwreck, yes, it is.
Okay, I will defer. There are so many questions. My question, you don't need to respond right now, but I wanted to make the opposite suggestion of Rasoul. I think for Strauss, somewhat paradoxically and surprisingly, Christianity actually poses the greater problem theologically, as opposed to those religions that understand themselves as primarily as law-based religions. So Judaism and Islam, precisely because they more purely articulate the problems that Eric referred to, right? I mean, in a way, it's not surprising that Strauss deals with law-based religions in Platonic political framework. But you don't have to respond to that now, but I already see. Maybe this is a good question to take up at the end. Alexis, your turn.
I can hear anything.
Uncharacteristic mute.
Yeah. Sorry, can you hear me? Now? Okay. So I had a question for Marco and Eric, maybe. So how do you think your contention helps solve Eric's question, in the sense that, is the problem with Christianity the fact that there is such a thing as Christian theology, that there is a fusion of philosophy and religion in Christianity? Or is the problem with Christianity the fact that it doesn't have a political theology? That Schmitt, as Pedersen argued, is wrong. There is no such thing as a political theology, which there is in Islam and Judaism. And it seems to me that if it's the first option, we're led to the Chicago interpretation. If it's the second option, we're led to the Texas option.
And BC. I'm professionally obligated to say Texas and BC.
Are you? Yeah, there's no. I don't know, Marco, if you want to go, because your question was addressed to both of us. There's no political theology in Christianity, but there's a law, and I think this. Maybe I could refer. This might be helpful to the audience, and maybe Marco too. But you mentioned it in passing, or not in passing, Brunner in particular, as among the theologians. You may want to take a look at Strauss's lecture, Reason and Revelation, that Heinrich Meyer published for our audience in this book, Leo Strauss and the Theological-Political Problem. I should be getting some royalties from Mr. Meyer. But there's on page 165 there, Strauss excerpts from a book by Brunner, and the excerpts are interesting because they suggest that Strauss is trying to find, even in those Christian theologians, indications of the centrality of the phenomenon of law. And I'll just, should I read the passage briefly, or just for the sake of our audience? The quotation is this: that according to the New Testament, and this is a quote from Brunner, this despairing knowledge of distress and need, that is the awareness of sin, comes from the law, which only makes demands. The law in question, and this is the quote, the law in question, quote, belongs absolutely to that which man can tell himself, i.e. it is meant to be accessible to man as men. And then he has another quote that says, and again, these are Brunner's words, it is a fact to which the scriptures and the best teachers of the church bear witness with one voice, that man as man knows the law of God. Indeed, that this knowledge of the law is the center of the natural human existence and the natural self-understanding of man. And so what you see, I think, there is Strauss not only indicating the centrality still for Christianity of the phenomenon of law, I mean, the Sermon on the Mount, to be, to put it simply, but also the suggestion that that law is understood to be accessible to human beings without the enlightenment of revelation. In other words, pointing to the possibility of a common ground between philosophy and revelation, that common ground being you could call it the moral awareness of human beings that is not thought to require, even by a fellow like Brunner, thought to require the enlightenment of revelation. And so this is, I think, a passage that bears on both the point you made, Marco, and the points that Hannes and Rasoul were asking about. I think this is of some interest. Anyway, people can look it up, buy the book, and then I'll ask Mr. Meyer, Dr. Meyer, for my royalties. Go ahead.
Well, thanks. I can just say a few words. Thanks for the questions. And thanks for quoting that passage, Eric, because that's very interesting. But still, it's very useful. So I see that Strauss was trying to gather some elements that would be helpful in building his argument. And of course, I still believe that the law, even though it's essential for the Christian teaching, it's not the core of Christianity. So there is something that still escapes that Platonic framework. You see what I mean? So the point is that I feel, but this is a true question, this is not rhetoric, I still think that there is something about Christianity that escapes Strauss's Platonic framework of interpreting revelation. Mm-hmm. So this is why I insisted on the figure of Jesus Christ and the word that becomes flesh, and I pointed to that book of Romano Guardini, which is a very classic book on the topic, so it's nothing new. But it seems sometimes, and of course, you can find other more radical theologians who deny the law and say, well, Christ brought us something more than the law. It didn't came to disrupt the law, it came to improve that. We know that stuff from the Sermon on the Mount, but still there are some Calvinists and very radical theologians that say, now we are in the time of grace. So the law is abolished, we are above the law. So I think there is still something that cannot be brought into that framework which puts the law at the center. In that way, it will be relatively easy to disprove or to add this final argument against revelation, because it will reduce revelation to something very rational, which is very, that practical rationality, which is pointed out also at the end of the preface on the Spinoza book, this of the American edition, when he says the wisdom of the Jewish revelation was the reason of his superiority before the nations. So there is some sort of a criterion to judge revelation, and this is a practical wisdom. So I don't know, maybe I guess that the figure of Jesus Christ is still a stumbling block also for Leo Strauss's framework. This is where I insist.
So we have two more questions, but very little time. So what I suggest we do is that both Zarko and Rasoul ask their question, and Marco, you can then decide whether you briefly want to respond or whether you want to put a pin in it and take it up later.
Yes, something very quick, actually. I mean, I just wanted to mention this because it comes up quite often in Strauss's writings, especially in the introduction of persecution and art of writing, that he thinks somehow Islam and Judaism are superior, I mean, quote unquote, in a way that you can understand the challenge of revelation better in those religions than in Christianity. Somehow, if you want me to put it in this way, Christianity somehow muddles the waters, right? That it becomes something like religion. It becomes something like philosophy. And that's one of the problems, right? I mean, that Christianity tends to absorb philosophy in itself. So you don't see the opposition anymore.
I suggest this, Zarko, as the topic of our next roundtable, because I strongly disagree.
Okay, right. So
that's all I had to say about this. But let's see what Marco
thank you.
thinks
Yeah, very
about
good.
it. Yeah,
very good point.
Yeah, we should probably move. But there's just a lot about love and not about incarnation, but love and agape, and even in On Tyranny, he quotes Cardinal Newman and refers to a line in 1 Peter 1:8. So it's not even law. So what is forgiveness? What is love? He's able to ask these questions. Okay. Right.
Marco, do you want to briefly?
I can say very quickly, I can answer just Zarko and then postpone to the discussion or questions. And let me say this. I want to frame it as a question. Can we read On Tyranny as a dialogue between the God of the Bible and the God of the philosophers? I guess we're going to talk about that later. Thanks.
Okay, with that being said, we thank you for a fascinating presentation. We'll now move on from Strauss the theologian to Strauss the historian, but a peculiar kind of historian. Rasoul will tell us what a Farabian historian is.
Okay, very good. So hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I would like to thank the organizers before everything else for inviting me to present my talk. So without further ado, let me just turn to the subject. I'm going to talk about Leo Strauss as a Farabian historian. And to that end, I am going to concentrate on a writing of Strauss titled Farabi's Plato, published in 1945. I take this writing of Strauss as a roadmap of his studies that can be described as historical. It is, I believe, in this writing that Strauss explains his historiographical approach. Let us then turn to this article. Farabi's Plato is an unusual text. Unlike many other independent articles of Strauss, it was not republished in Strauss's edited volumes during his lifetime. It has therefore this unusual character from the beginning. The other noteworthy characteristic of this article is that this article is of highly autobiographical character. Reading it, one cannot help but observe a perfect agreement between Strauss and the figure discussed in the article, namely Al-Farabi. To begin with, one has difficulty finding any critical aspect in this article. But the autobiographical character of the article becomes even more explicit when one concentrates on the content of the article. The article is a discussion of a very minor writing of Al-Farabi. In Arabic edition, with all the editorial additions, the text is only 21 short pages. Putting it next to other writings of Al-Farabi, this work is not very famous and is mostly ignored in the contemporary scholarship. The reason for the lack of interest in this work of Al-Farabi is its problematic character. The title of the work is The Philosophy of Plato, Its Parts, and the Grade of Dignity of Its Parts from its beginning to its end. In other words, in this work, Al-Farabi is trying to provide the reader with some kind of summary of all Platonic writings that he has at his disposal. In fact, he mentions almost all Platonic writings in his text. But when Al-Farabi presents these writings of Plato, there are many things that don't make much sense. For instance, many classic Platonic ideas are absent in Al-Farabi's presentation, and many comments made about Platonic writings seem quite fanciful. But in view of the idiosyncratic character of this work by Al-Farabi, why did Strauss decide to write on this work instead of other more significant writings of Al-Farabi, like, for instance, Virtue's City? The reason is quite simple, actually, and is quite significant. Al-Farabi is here presenting himself as a historian. And that's why Strauss is interested in this specific writing of Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi is doing what Strauss does in his own writings. It is therefore significant that Strauss turns out to be very sympathetic to Al-Farabi in this article. You can learn something about Strauss's own method of historiography by reading what he thinks about Al-Farabi's historiography. Now, here Strauss encounters the problem that I just mentioned. He has to explain the idiosyncratic content of Al-Farabi's historical work, especially two missing ideas in his summary of Platonic writings. Al-Farabi fails to mention two famous Platonic ideas, the doctrine of the ideas and the immortality of the soul. Al-Farabi provides a summary of Phaedrus, Phaedo, and Republic, but fails to mention these two famous Platonic ideas. One cannot explain these missing points by saying that they were marginal or unimportant aspects of Platonic writings or thought. So how does Strauss explain their absence in Al-Farabi's text? The answer isn't surprising at all. Strauss makes use of his famous idea. Al-Farabi is an esoteric writer. He ignores some ideas in his presentation of Platonic writings to convey an esoteric message. In fact, Al-Farabi is not only an esoteric writer, but also an esoteric reader. He is aware that Plato speaks about ideas and about immortality of the soul, but he thinks that Plato didn't genuinely subscribe to these ideas and only spoke about them exoterically. Consequently, according to Strauss, Al-Farabi is silent about doctrine of ideas and immortality of the soul in order to imply that Plato did not genuinely subscribe to these ideas. You can clearly find here many aspects of Strauss's mature thought. Strauss is a historian, although as far as I know, he never introduced himself as a historian. On occasion, he calls himself a political scientist or a scholar, but he has been taken more seriously by fellow historians than political scientists. He is considered a historian, but a peculiar kind of historian, a historian who practices esoteric reading and perhaps esoteric writing. This has led to some famous debates around Strauss's writings and interpretations. His readings of Plato, Hobbes, Locke, and Machiavelli have been criticized by other historians who don't believe the writings of these authors have an esoteric dimension that Strauss is talking about. Others have tried to defend Strauss's readings of these figures and have added supplementary evidence for Strauss's interpretations. As we are interested in the future themes in Strauss's studies, I should mention that there are here themes to pursue in future studies. The question of esotericism itself is a historical practice. As a historical practice has been discussed most famously in Arthur Meltzer's book, Philosophy Between the Lines. Building on his research, one theme that deserves more research is the specific methods of esoteric writing that Strauss mentions in his own writings, like numerology, importance of central items in enumerations, contradictions, and similar techniques. Strauss mentions evidence for some of these techniques. More research on these methods is required. Another possible theme is the study of esotericism in Islamic thought. A systematic study of esotericism in Islamic sources can lead to interesting results. Furthermore, discussion of Strauss's classic interpretations taking into account new evidence coming to light is another promising research theme. To give you an example, Strauss was emphatic that you must understand John Locke's thought while taking his relationship with Thomas Hobbes into account. This claim has been rejected by many Locke scholars who, following Peter Lustet, claim that Locke was not in Hobbes at all. New evidence has come to light showing that Strauss was actually completely right. James Tyrrell, one of Locke's closest acquaintances, says that Locke, quote, almost always, unquote, had Hobbes's Leviathan on his table in Oxford. The next step would be to draw lessons from Locke's silence on Hobbes. Why doesn't Locke mention Hobbes in his writings? All these are promising new research orientations that should be pursued in the future. But I would like to emphasize another possible theme that is connected to the article of Strauss that I just discussed. As I mentioned, Strauss is prominently treated as a historian, and this is absolutely justified. But what kind of historian was he? There are different kinds of historians, and some are closer to what Strauss was than the others. Let me mention a few figures who were also historians, but who I believe are much closer to Strauss than typical contemporary historians. Martin Heidegger was also a historian of philosophy, as was Hannah Arendt. Their works have this emphatic historical dimension that one also finds in Strauss's writings. There is another historian who has much more in common with Strauss than one thinks, Alexandre Kojève. Kojève had a famous public debate with Strauss, and he concentrated on Hegel's philosophy throughout his life. The result was reflected in his famous seminar and also his book, Introduction to the Reading of Hegel. Kojève was also the author of a multi-volume history of Greek philosophy. I believe Strauss was pursuing a specific type of historiography that resembles what you find in the works of these figures. I believe entertaining this possibility that Strauss was a historian like Heidegger or Kojève would have major repercussions on our understanding of Strauss's interpretations and writings. Now, to know more about this type of historiography, I believe one has to concentrate on one specific paragraph of Farabi's Plato, paragraph number 21, where Strauss makes very ambiguous and also thought-provoking comments on Al-Farabi's specific form of historiography. This key paragraph has many aspects that I don't pretend to fully understand, but let me mention a single point. It is interesting that in this paragraph, Strauss introduces Al-Farabi as the imitator of Plato and Socrates when it comes to historiography. For Strauss, Plato and Socrates were also historians. Plato wrote about Socrates, a historical figure, and presented himself as a historian of Socratic philosophy. Socrates also presents himself in the guise of a historian of Egypt in Phaedrus, and this is emphasized by Strauss in this paragraph. Al-Farabi, Plato, and Socrates are Strauss's model historians. What can perhaps help us better understand the type of historiography practiced by these figures is to begin with the footnote number 49 of Strauss's article, which points to Plato's Protagoras and Charmides, where Socrates speaks about his historical intentions. But that would be a subject suitable for another talk, and that is all I had to say on this occasion. Thank you so much for your patience.
Go ahead, Alex.
Alex, first question.
Thank you, Rasoul. This is a talk very much related to what I'm going to present after you. But one line that I think from Farabi's Plato that he then keeps in the sort of adapted version in Persecution is this line about the specific immunity of the commentator or of the historian, which would, I think, be clear. It's not, Farabi is not a historian, he's a commentator. Strauss is a historian. So it seems to be linking himself to Farabi. I was just interested in what your thoughts on that line are and how that relates to Strauss's method of historiography.
Yes, well, actually, you're absolutely right that he keeps this specific line. He says that at the beginning of, I think in the introduction of Persecution and Art of Writing, he says that I have made some use of this article. What it means, it's unclear completely what it means actually, because he doesn't use many parts of the article, specifically this specific paragraph that I mentioned. It doesn't make use of that at all. So, both in the article, he actually calls Al-Farabi a historian or a commentator, right? That's the terms, these are the terms that he uses for Al-Farabi. But I think that is what is problematic for me, because he reflects these parts of his article that correspond exactly to the old, the old traditional idea of esoteric writing. He reuses these in his book, but he leaves out this part, which is not at all about protecting yourself against persecution or something along those lines. So he just tries to somehow suppress this very really problematic paragraph in his work. He just concentrates on the fact that, well, you want to understand esotericism, it is about protecting yourself against persecution, just saving your life, so on and so forth, or protecting society against dangerous truths. It doesn't have anything to do with historiography. So he doesn't repeat this in Persecution and Art of Writing, and I find it quite actually strange. Why he doesn't do that? I mean, that's a long question, and people have suggested some things why he might have not been interested in republishing this article, but these are, I think, all hypotheses, right? We don't know exactly, but very good question, yeah.
Alexis and then Marco.
Yeah, in his book on Hobbes, he from 1935, he describes his project as a developmental history. Do you think it's a term that still applies to his later works? And if so, do you have any idea where he took that odd qualification of his work from? Is it, in the scholarly context of the era? And what do you make of that phrase?
Yes, that's a very good question, actually, when you think about Strauss's early writings. And I think he used to say, I mean, I have heard it from several people that he used to say that he didn't like his book on Hobbes at all. Later years, he would say that. Because I think in his book on Hobbes, he was this very traditional historian. And that's why people who reject Strauss completely still like his book on Hobbes, because he still was part of our profession. But later on, he really changed. I think, yes, so I would say in Hobbes, probably he is a very respected and very traditional historian that we would like to see in his later writings. I mean, not us. Most of the scholars who are historians would have liked to see Strauss in the same way in later writings. But he just throws the whole manual, right? At the end, he doesn't quote anybody, he doesn't cite anybody. He's just strange. So, yeah. Very good.
This is just a comment, something I think you've seen in when he wrote the literary character in the Guide of the Perplexed. He's writing very intensively with Paul Krauss at the time. Strauss writes to Krauss, "You of course didn't fail to see that this long essay begins with historians."
Yeah.
And ends with people who are able to understand by themselves.
Yes. No, yeah, that's.
then he adds, this is speaking of future themes, then he adds, my commentary on this movement is the chapter on history in the Hobbes book.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. That's a thought-provoking. Yes, I have no comment about this, but yes, he is very much engaged with historians here. He's very much engaged with historians here, and he's, I mean, if you look at this paragraph number 21, at the end, he has all these quotation marks about individuality, about contribution of a historian, so on and so forth, right? And he questions somehow these ideas that individuality is very much related to the question of historiography, you see, because history is about individual instances, while philosophy is about universals, particulars and universals. And he's putting quotation marks around individuals, personals, particulars, and he wants to emphasize this universality that is in philosophy, which is in conflict somehow with history. Very good.
So thanks, Rasoul, for your presentation. I wanted to ask you, you didn't mention that, but the other great essay of Strauss on Farabi's, on how Farabi read Plato's law, the closing of that essay, and I mentioned that for the audience, Strauss at the end says, we admire the ease with which Farabi invented Platonic speeches. Do you think this is part of this self-presentation of Strauss? This is premised on the quite reckless idea that Farabi is a stand-in of Strauss himself. This is an idea with which I've been toying for many years, so I thought, okay, if in the Farabi's Plato, Strauss is speaking of himself. So it's a self-presentation. And I took it to the most extreme conclusion when I read also the other essay on how Farabi read Plato's law, namely in the historiography, in the history of political philosophy. I don't mean the book, I mean the gesture of narrating the history of political philosophy of Strauss. I think, and I want to ask you if you agree with this position, with what I'm saying. I thought that, of course, there was a very serious contribution to the understanding of past philosophers. But at the same time, all those philosophers, namely Machiavelli, Locke, and so on, they almost were just like characters in a Platonic dialogue. So they do not match the truth. They are partially an invention of Strauss because he has an agenda, a philosophical politics. So I don't know if you agree with me, because I really much tend to push the limits, the final sentence in the other Farabian essay. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Marco. I mean, these are very interesting points, especially at the end of how Farabi read Plato's law, right? He has some corrections also in the manuscript that I discuss also, I believe, in my book. So there is this idea, obviously, whether, I mean, how far you can push this whole idea. That's why I hesitate somehow to just draw all the conclusions from this. That's why I also said that I take him seriously as a historian, because we can learn a lot of things from him about these figures. Cannot just say that these are just complete inventions. He was not, I don't know, there are some figures like that, I suppose, but I'm not going to name anybody. But there are scholars who just make up stuff. But Strauss was not certainly that. But you have to make a decision whether you should treat him as a historian per se, because he has been mainly treated like that by people who don't identify with Straussian ideas in general, right? Other people don't care about him. There are only historians who read him, and in order to reject him. And this is very problematic, I think, because, you know, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Heidegger and also Arendt at first would receive these kinds of objections, that people would say, well, is this really Protagoras? I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, at first people would say these kind of things, but after a while they would say, well, come on, I mean, this is not the main issue here. The main issue is what this person is saying. But this has never actually happened with Strauss. Meaning people are really fixated on these kind of points. And I have been fixated on these kind of points. You see, it's a kind of self-criticism too, that I have done the same thing, but people are continuing to do the same thing. I have repented, but they are continuing. So that's some kind of invitation that we should all repent. Yeah.
Eric?
Before Eric starts, Eric, you get the last question, but then we should move on.
If there's no time, it's fine.
No.
Okay.
Ask your
I was
question.
going to ask, all right, briefly, Rasoul, thank you for your presentation. What if someone were to argue against Strauss or object to Strauss, that Strauss wishes to go back to ancient thought? And yet, when we turn to ancient thought, we see a real belittling of history. Aristotle suggests that history is sub-philosophic, certainly less philosophic than poetry, because only poetry deals in universals, as you indicated, history deals in particulars. The scheme of education in Plato's Republic, all the things that the future philosophers need to learn, history is nowhere mentioned there. So is there not? Yes, there is some historical inquiries. One can think, for example, of the first book of the Metaphysics in Aristotle, so exploring what, the endoxai, what others have said before, but that is certainly not the pith and substance of Aristotle's thought or body of work. And yet in the case of Strauss, it is. So what about this relation between philosophy and history? How does one understand this seeming contradiction of Strauss being, as you suggest, a historian, and yet returning to the thought that seems to have little regard for history ultimately?
I would say that, I mean, first of all, there is no contradiction, obviously, because he agrees completely with this Aristotelian view. And I think in this paragraph at the end, it is Aristotle that is talking somehow, right? It's coming through that history is about particulars, and particulars are not very philosophic. So at the end of the day, this is not what you should be doing. History is different from philosophy. So that's what is coming through somehow. But on the other hand, I think, his historiography, there is this element that I didn't talk much about because it is controversial, is this question of esotericism, right? What is esotericism exactly? Is esotericism really a kind of historical technique that you can actually find evidence for? I don't know, and I doubt we can. I have tried to show that it exists, but I doubt that I have been very successful. Esotericism is very much in the service of philosophizing. It's making history more philosophical somehow. Let's put it this way. When you use esotericism, it helps you to make something philosophical out of these dead documents that deal with particulars. Let me put it that way, right? Yeah. I don't know if have I been very mysterious when I said these kind of things. Maybe I'm a bit confused. That's why I can't come through in this way.
I think that was at least a very radical ending. Thank you very much, Rasoul, for your presentation.
All right. We have
Zarko, you're supposed to
one more,
yeah,
similar topic. Leo Strauss's Scholar-Philosopher. But Alex Prio.
Thank you, Zarko, and thank you to you and Hannes for hosting this. And this will pick up, I think, on Rasoul's final provocative point as well. As my title suggests, I'm going to attempt to make the case in the brief time I have, all of the brief time I have, that Leo Strauss was a hybrid of the scholar and the philosopher, in addition to saying something about what Strauss intended with this hybrid and what it might mean for the Straussian school and future studies of Strauss. Now, my suggestion should immediately meet with opposition, for Strauss was, by his own words, only a scholar and not a philosopher. He writes, for example, in an introduction to Heideggerian existentialism, that Heidegger made a distinction between philosophers and those for whom philosophy is identical with the history of philosophy. He made a distinction, in other words, between the thinker and the scholar. I know that I am only a scholar. If Strauss is only a scholar, he could not be, as I claim in my title, a scholar-philosopher, to say nothing of a philosopher simply. My former teacher, Lawrence Burns, however, once made the case to me, quite persuasively, that this was the only claim by Strauss that he could demonstrably refute. Strauss, he noted, characterizes philosophers as much more cautious than we scholars are. Yet Strauss himself is much more cautious than we scholars are. It therefore follows by modus tollens that Strauss was not only a scholar, but also a philosopher. It follows too, I believe, that Strauss calls himself only a scholar ironically. For if he anywhere exhibits the inferior caution of the scholar, if he anywhere is too sure of his ground, it's precisely when he calls himself only a scholar. Such irony suggests that in describing himself as radically dependent on the work of the great thinkers, Strauss does a version of what he attributes to Farabi. He avails himself of the specific immunity of the commentator or of the historian. That is, Strauss appears to have revived the medieval model of the philosopher as commentator in the form of the philosopher as historian or scholar. By Strauss's presentation, a massive gulf separates the philosopher from the scholar. How then did he hope to bridge that gulf? To answer that question, it's best to turn to Persecution and the Art of Writing, where Strauss makes his most substantial reflections on historiographical method. Strauss presents Persecution in a twofold manner. In the preface, he says that the essays in the book all deal with one problem, the problem of the relation between philosophy and politics. In the introduction, however, Strauss makes a more modest and scholarly claim. The following essays may be said to supply material for a future sociology of philosophy, itself a legitimate subdivision of sociology of knowledge. Persecution thus has both a philosophic and a scholarly aim. On the one hand, to present a philosophic problem, and on the other, to establish within the academy a subdivision in a field of study in a discipline in the social sciences. Far more modest. Strauss can do both at once because his core contribution relates to both, and that core contribution is the philosophic distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric teaching of a text. Though Strauss's remarks on this distinction cannot help but be philosophic, he attempts at the outset to remain strictly within the horizon of his academic audience. This self-limitation and its irony is especially evident when he confronts the question of whether the recent change in intellectual climate around the rationalist tradition is to be considered a progress or a decline. He refuses here to address this question since only the philosopher can answer it, even though he would treat it at length in Natural Right and History, published the very next year. He instead takes up the more modest duty imposed on the historian by developing from this distinction a series of rules that might guide future historiography. Contemporary scholars, Strauss argues, are inclined to identify the philosopher as a member of a motley crowd called the intellectuals or the sages, and thus to blur the distinction between the philosopher and similar yet inferior types. But the scholar Strauss urges to develop the sociology of philosophy, and to whom he supplies these new rules, will always bear in mind the gulf that separates all other men, themselves included, from the philosopher, and so will seek rare glimpses of his esoteric teaching, something Strauss reassures such scholars they already unwittingly do. Strauss thus advances this distinction that it might serve as a humbling reminder to the scholar that his distinctive virtue, caution, finds greater and fuller expression in his superior philosopher. But which scholars does Strauss have in mind? He clarifies his hopes toward the end of On a Forgotten Kind of Writing, a short piece written in response to two critical reviews of Persecution. More precisely, Strauss responds to these two reviews for the sake of a group of students at the University of Chicago, students he goes on to call his young friends. Strauss addresses those critical reviews because he suspects that these objections arose out of difficulties similar to those that various students have felt. Now, why did Strauss not respond more directly to the reviewers, as he does, for example, with his restatement on Xenophon's hero? Certainly, in posing their questions to Strauss, these students seem curious and open-minded. But while these qualities might suffice to distinguish them from the first reviewer, George Sabine, that cannot be the case with the second, Yvonne Belleval, whom Strauss explicitly credits with open-mindedness. It seems rather that Strauss was interested not just in open-mindedness, but in youth, that he writes not so much for existing or established scholars, but for future scholars curious about Strauss's distinctive and intriguing approach to academic historiography. The suspicion is confirmed at the end of the essay where Strauss writes, "At the very least, the observations I have made will force historians, sooner or later, to abandon the complacency with which they claim to know what the great thinkers thought, to admit that the thought of the past is much more enigmatic than it is generally held to be, and to begin to wonder whether the historical truth is not as difficult of access as the philosophic truth. I would be happy," Strauss says, "if there were suspicion of crime where up to now there has only been implicit faith in perfect innocence." I'll just know that so far as I'm aware, this is the only place in Strauss's published works where he comments on the conditions of his own happiness, which is, I think, a pretty important point. Strauss's comparison here of historical and philosophic truth helps us appreciate his hybrid of the philosopher and the scholar. Earlier in this essay, Strauss corrects Belleville for attributing to him the apparent concern with making historical inquiries independent of every philosophic postulate. Strauss responds, "I did not suggest that one can make the study of the history of philosophy independent of every philosophic postulate. History of philosophy necessarily presupposes the persistence of the same fundamental problems. This and this alone is the transtemporal truth which must be admitted if there is to be history of philosophy." Strauss immediately cautions the historian against the acceptance of any solution to the fundamental problems, lest it impede his sympathy or care. I can't address here what Strauss means by the fundamental problem, save for observing that in the first chapter of Natural Right and History, he associates awareness of the fundamental problems and therewith of the fundamental alternatives regarding their solution with philosophy in its original Socratic sense. This association, when combined with our observations above, permits us to advance the following suggestion. Strauss's distinction between the exoteric and esoteric teachings of a great thinker aims to make a future generation of scholars aware that there exists in the philosopher's work a realm of thought beyond the doctrines he proposes, that in this realm he articulates the fundamental philosophic problems, to which those doctrines admittedly can never hope to be adequate solutions, that he articulates these problems with a care and quietness far exceeding what his exoteric teaching would incline scholars to expect, and finally that this articulation in it alone constitutes his contribution to the tradition of political philosophy initiated by Socrates. The philosopher's work thereby manages to address his political circumstances by advancing a doctrine that, properly thought through, inducts its best readers into his ranks. Strauss seems to have accomplished just this within the Academy with his own works, and it is to this accomplishment that I refer in calling Strauss a scholar-philosopher. Strauss's hybrid of the scholar and the philosopher would therefore be his version of what he refers to as philosophic politics in his restatement on Xenophon's hero. Such politics requires in part satisfying the city that the philosophers are not irresponsible adventurers, but good citizens and even the best of citizens. This is the defense of philosophy which was required always and everywhere, whatever the regime might have been. Philosophic politics therefore consists in the philosopher's attempt to reconcile on the level of common opinion his end wisdom with that of the gentleman, decency. But because this reconciliation takes place only on the level of common opinion, it necessarily obscures the fact that the philosopher and the non-philosophers cannot have genuinely common deliberations. There's a fundamental disproportion between philosophy and the city. That is, the problem that Strauss refers to in the preface of persecution is the very same as that which informs the philosophic politics of the ancients, indeed of philosophers in any age. Strauss's practice of philosophic politics within the Academy thus aimed to make the way of life of the philosopher respectable by establishing a kinship between the scholar and the philosopher, a kinship in caution and care when it comes to truth. But again, it also sought to make the scholar humbler in his claims by likewise illustrating the gulf that separates him from the philosopher, a gulf again in caution and care. By encouraging such humility, even reverence on the part of scholars before the great thinkers of the past, and therewith before the insoluble fundamental problems, Strauss counteracted the nihilistic implications of contemporary positivism and historicism. He thereby also counteracted the most shocking ideological experiments of modernity, communism and fascism, those grandiose failures stemming from Marx and Nietzsche, that make it easier for us who have experienced those failures to understand again the old saying that wisdom cannot be separated from moderation. Inasmuch as achieving this aim would aid in rehabilitating the reputation of liberal education, thus of philosophy, it no doubt contributed to Strauss's philosophic politics. Strauss's intention extended likewise to the regime under which he would eventually make his home. Every reader of Strauss's lecture, German Nihilism, will grasp how much progressive education contributed to the Weimar youth's rejection of liberal democracy and embrace of fascism, aided and abetted, of course, by the militarism of German society at the time. And many noticed, too, the comparison of German education to English education, and how the latter was able to produce a Churchill, a living example of how greatness was still possible in a liberal society, contrary to the convictions of the young German nihilists. Of course, by Strauss's own admission, Churchill came too late and in the wrong country, to say nothing of the impossibility of simply importing English educational institutions without the national character necessary to support them. Strauss does, however, suggest another corrective in the absence of the national character, educational institutions, and political models conducive to moderation, in his critique of the modern pedagogue. I am convinced that about the most dangerous thing for these young men was precisely what is called progressive education. They rather needed old-fashioned teachers, such old-fashioned teachers, of course, as would be undogmatic enough to understand the aspirations of their pupils. Witnessing the increased influence of certain strands of continental thought on American higher education and the creeping nihilism consequent to that influence, Strauss spoke to his adoptive regime with the intention in part of reviving the tradition of political philosophy and of arguing in particular on behalf of the possibility of a normative political theory on the model of classical political philosophy. In so doing, Strauss presented himself as one such old-fashioned yet undogmatic teacher of the great thinkers. I hope that my somewhat scattered remarks have gone some way in convincing you all of the centrality of the Academy to Strauss's political project. Strauss labored with rare intellectual focus and intensity to revive and make reputable the dying tradition of political philosophy in such a way as to inject humility and moderation into the social sciences and its practitioners, and therefore into the regime. He labored in particular to mold a future generation of scholars through his writing, teaching, and mentorship, a group of scholars that has come to be known as the Straussian school with its various and competing factions. Straussianism is an academic phenomenon and by design. It is important to note, of course, that more than a few Straussians have looked beyond the academy. Some have done so out of necessity, some out of political ambition, and some out of angered frustration to those who appear to address the crisis of the West or the decline of the American regime with yet another monograph on Plato. But some have also done so, I say that as the author of 3 monographs on Plato, but some have also done so, I believe, with an eye to many of Strauss's concerns, certainly as regards the increasing ideological capture of the contemporary academy, something I think Strauss acknowledges in his later writings. There is, I mean to say, a genuine concern arising from many motivations that goes unaddressed. My hope is that by investigating Strauss's project as an academic phenomenon, we might better understand his thought and intention, and thereby conceive of whether he would have reformed that project in light of our changed circumstances, and if so, how. We can begin to do this by investigating how Strauss approached the various tasks typical of the scholar, how he approached historiography, criticism, mentorship, correspondence, and so on. Such investigations would, I contend, impart greater knowledge of Strauss's thought, but they might at the same time have the additional benefit of affording us greater knowledge of ourselves, inasmuch as we remain creatures of his project. Thank you.
I don't see a hand. I'm going to ask a quick. Oh, there's a hand, but it's too late. I'm going to ask a question. There was this part of Beyond Good and Evil, which is we scholars. I think, what is the preceding chapter? Somehow it talks about democratization. And Strauss says that the separation of scholarship from philosophy, according to Nietzsche, is due to democratization. And that's a very good observation or something like that. And then it gives 2 examples. The Weber, who has equality of values, great scholarship, but somehow equality of values. So it's even more democratized in the wrong way, I'd say. And then Husserl, who tries to recover philosophy, but says you have to combine it with Weltanschauung. And he says something like, this is a course, but maybe he says it in 2 courses. The diagnosis is very good, but if Nietzsche meant to remedy it, it didn't work. So I think, I don't know, when did Strauss stop working? 50 years ago? He's had only half of the time that Nietzsche had to effect the change. Has there been some, it seems to not be getting better, or what is yours?
I don't know. I mean, there's a few later remarks on the Academy from the 60s that I think are worth, the liberal education essays, particular liberal education and responsibility, where he talks about outposts. And, he's addressing continuing education students. But I think there's also a sort of sense of a sort of a possibility that what he's doing will sort of fade out, right? And also in an epilogue where he's way more confrontational than he ever is. And of course, the fallout from that was pretty bad. And but maybe thought it's time for something a bit more. The first would point to the sense that maybe what he's doing will find a home outside the academy among certain groups of people. It certainly has to some degree. And the second points to perhaps a more aggressive approach that needs to be taken than he took, say, in his earlier sort of proposals a decade or so earlier in Persecution, which is much more gentle and ignores many of the uglier implications of his criticism. So,
Aaron, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for a very fine presentation. Yeah, I guess my question is a version of the same question, but in connection with Strauss's philosophic politics, how should we, in connection with with academia, was he successful? I mean, did he convince other scholars that philosophers, or at least Straussians, which are 2 different categories, are decent? That's hardly clear to me. And one could ask in particular, I mean, one of the very big reasons for the hostility to Strauss or Straussians is connect with his rediscovery of esoteric writing and what it implies about equality. And Strauss really stressed that a lot. Was there some unwisdom in that stress, precisely with a view to the goal that you sketched?
Yeah, so I think it's on the first point. In that statement about philosophy, does he convince them that they're decent? Probably not. I mean, Straussians have been called a Straussian is still a dirty word. But there is something far humbler about his approach. In the essay on Rietzler, he makes it clear that Rietzler's more than a scholar; he's a gentleman. And so, one way to think about this is nice praise for Rietzler. It's also maybe an interesting statement for thinking about the types available to Strauss within a democracy for him to sort of accommodate to the philosopher. So that's one sort of observation that maybe needs to be addressed. As far as convincing other scholars or even philosophers, it's interesting. I was just rereading his restatement where he has that interesting discussion of the preferability of the sect over the party and other remarks and the need for schools. But that schools means always a plurality of schools and even factions within schools. And I do think to a certain degree, when you see people who have struggled against Strauss, even pretty aggressively, they do feel the need to, on some level, concede even a small point. And you see this with greater literalness of translations. They'll praise his Hobbes book, which I think is actually a lot better than a lot of people say. I quite enjoy it. Or in starting to concede the dramatic aspects of a Platonic dialogue, not in the truly radical way that Strauss does it, but incorporating some of his observations, often criminally without acknowledging his role. But in that way, I think Strauss did achieve to some degree that goal, that there is at least some suspicion of a crime. And I've been to panels with analytic philosophers discussing Plato, and they'll start to dismiss an argument on dramatic reasons. Like, oh, well, this argument's bad, but there are these indications that Socrates doesn't endorse him. Now, if you get them to agree that everything following, book 2 or book 1 of the Republic that Socrates says is a matter of a pious defense of justice, that's another a further bridge that they won't cross. But I do think there's been some success as a result.
Thank you.
Go ahead, I think Marco, and then we can begin to bring in questions from the audience.
Thanks, Alex, for your presentation. That was very insightful. And I want to ask you about that mention of personal happiness, because if I get it, that's very peculiar, because the way in which he frames the possibility of his own happiness, it depends on the success of his research. It's not intrinsic to the research. So I wonder, is that philosophical happiness, or is that the scholarly happiness, which depends on the reception from other people, from the young friends? So this is very puzzling to me.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the young friends, if that's his audience. I mean, it's if you compare the restatement where he's responding directly to Voegelin and then at length to Kojève, it's interesting. You have the same basic structure, 2 reviewers, one superior to the other. He treats the inferior one and then the superior one, and then but here he's very clear to filter it through these young students who have requested some comment. And if they are his friends, if there's some graduate students or something, or students in his class, and he convinces them, then you could say that that fits within the sort of philosophic politics as it's detailed in the restatement. It is a weird thing in writing something that on the one hand, you hope to address, a larger group and perhaps people beyond your death, but there is also this more moderate thing that you're sharing your thoughts and you hope people have interesting things to say about it when they read it. And it seems like the more narrow and is what Strauss is referring to in his personal happiness, that when you write something or you teach something, you do hope that you get that email or that response from a student or somebody else that suggests somebody's taken what you've said seriously and has something intelligent to say or to ask you about it.
Okay. Can just a short follow-up. So would you say that that kind of happiness is part of the philosophical happiness? Because I was convinced that on the basis of other readings, that the philosophical activity is self-rewarding. So one reaches some kind of divine self-sufficiency because one does not need the ascent, the success. So I guess if it's more complex than it looked like, at least to me, so maybe this relationship with young friends is more important to the philosophical way of life than I thought.
I mean, there are these remarks that Strauss makes about the inability, if you admire your own development and wisdom, you will necessarily admire the good ordering of a soul anywhere you find it, right? And I don't know how if one wants to take that seriously or not. I tend to find it a fairly serious suggestion that it's what you feel when you read a truly great book. You really can sense the author when you get in touch with what's happening. You sense the author thinking, and you're moved by the seriousness, the decisions they make in following this thought and where they come out, and that strikes me as a rational basis for friendship, for talking with others. I want to say one thing about esotericism related to what Rasoul was saying, that Strauss never uses, as far as I'm aware, just like he sort of stops using natural right of Plato and Socrates, except in a couple of moments in like The City and Man, for example. He also doesn't use esoteric and exoteric when he's discussing how to read Plato. It's about drama. And one thought I'd throw out there is that the esoteric-exoteric distinction, which you find really clearly in medieval texts, might be a more accessible version of what is a finer point in many other thinkers, certainly in Plato, where it's more like reading poetry or interpreting poetry than it is sort of the sort of decoding that you might engage with the medievals. I'll leave it at that.
And I just one short note on this brings us down from the great heights that Alex has lifted us up to. But On a Forgotten Kind of Writing is indeed based on. We know who the young friend is. It's Chip Carments, the then editor of the Chicago Review, requested a clarification from Strauss. In the Gadamer archive in Germany, in the Deutsche Literaturarchiv, there's a carbon copy of Strauss's letter, which is a response to this question, which is essentially on a Forgotten Kind of Right, and it's dated on December 24th, 1953. So we know the addressee, and we sort of know the backstory. But I don't think this answers the deeper question or higher question.
Please send me that, because I mean it's entirely possible you used an entirely mundane situation and transformed it into a sort of philosophic sort of occasion. But I'd love to read that. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's still possible. It's Bernadette, Alex. Don't give up, because he says plural friends, right? He's going to help others and so on. I mean, Bernadette could be the addressee. All right. Well, we can go back to some of the questions about theology as well, but there are a few questions in the which I want to address at least some. I'm not sure who can address it, but I want us to address. There was one question by Keith Whitaker about Strauss studies, whether there's something, because it's in the title, something, I don't know if he's approving of it. I don't know if he wants to come in and explain, or it's a little, it's a comment in relation to Platonic studies in Platonic political philosophy. Would Strauss have enjoyed or approved of Strauss studies? And how are Strauss studies doing? I guess he had at least two questions. But on that first question, does anybody want to say something, whether Strauss wants to be studied in this way, in the way in which people study Plato?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Does he want to be studied? Does he want his works to be studied in the way that we study Plato? Yeah.
Yeah.
The question would be whether Strauss himself wrote the way that Plato wrote, or arguably. And
yeah,
insofar as he did, then he would have to be, if Strauss is right in his study of Plato, then of course he has to be read in the same way. But there might be a difficulty that Strauss rediscovers the matter of writing of the ancients only gradually, and therefore not, there's obviously a difference between the work of the 30s and the work of the 60s or the 70s from that point of view. And so I'm not sure that the practice, I don't know if looking for central paragraphs in an essay written in the 1930s, I'm not sure that makes a whole lot of sense. It may make more sense and may be necessary when you were talking about, work from the 60s or 70s. But I don't know, this is just off the top of my head. But of course he wants to be studied. I mean, yes.
Maybe
Yeah.
The panel can address the second question more broad. Are there obvious aspects where Strauss studies falls short? No.
I mean, yeah,
so
sure. I mean, there are abuses of the notion of esotericism to discard arguments that one doesn't really have a means to meet. Even one could even raise the question, are there some limitations in Strauss himself? I mean, Strauss dedicated his whole life to the study of political philosophy, but political philosophy, by his own admission, is only a part of philosophy. And if you look at the works, say, of Aristotle, it's only a small part of philosophy. The philosophy is the study of nature, the study of the whole. One doesn't find that for the most part in Strauss. And so one could criticize the Straussian school for being too Straussian from this point of view. And, I mean, doing something analogous to what, by Aristotle's account, happened with Socrates, comparing Socrates to the pre-Socratics, kind of forgetting about the questions pertaining to the whole and limiting oneself to the study of human affairs, human politics. I think there's some self-criticism or that needs to take place on the part of the Straussian school. Philosophy is not just political philosophy.
true. A certain Bernhard Trout just asked in the chat, why is Strauss
a scientist? Yeah.
why is Strauss on science not a future theme in Strauss studies?
Yeah.
And he asks because Professor Minkov's book is definitive, and while it is, of course, definitive, that is not the case. We in no way want to suggest that our future themes are exhaustive, but I think sort of that question points in a similar direction.
Can I bring Professor Barber if he wants to be brought in? He's raised his hand. I don't know if I guess I'll try to bring him in. Let's see. If it doesn't work, maybe you can type it in. But it's a raised hand rather than a typed question. Let me try. Or at least allowed to talk. Okay, there you go.
You have to unmute yourself.
I think unless he typed the question, I don't think he did. Right?
I don't know how to do that.
It's good.
But,
you've done it.
I raised my hand accidentally. So.
Oh, I see. All right.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, good.
Nope. There you go.
Okay.
Can I add to Strauss? I think another important theme, which I'm just not qualified to comment on, is Strauss on technology, which obviously Tim Burns's book is a good contribution to. But there are all sorts of interesting remarks in The City and Man on techne, as well as in obviously thoughts on Machiavelli and this clear distinction. I think, especially now with current issues. And Strauss looking at this problem. There's actually a course where he talks about AI, actually. So. But one wonders, how these remarks after all these technological development, how they might inform current issues, but also situate current issues within the larger narrative or set of questions that Strauss lays out.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim's book, it raised this question very, very powerfully, the connection between Strauss and technology. And he also, Tim, I think, demonstrates the importance of that dimension for Strauss's distinction between ancients and moderns. On the other hand, I don't think Tim takes this as criticism of his book, but I think it's not at all exhaustive. And Strauss, it's also, especially given the importance he assigns to technology in modernity. And it's kind of strange how little explicit discussion there is, right? It's kind of surprising if you compare him to, I don't know, Hans Jonas or Heidegger himself. For these thinkers, technology is important, and they're right about technology. For Strauss, technology seems to be important, and he doesn't.
There is this anecdote
by that name.
He was asked by Carol Mitchum, who is a philosopher of technology, to write on technology, the philosophy of technology. And he said, that's a very important topic, but why don't you ask Joseph Cropsey? And then Mitchum asked Cropsey, and Cropsey said, that's a really crucial topic, but can you ask Leon Kass? And he asked Leon Kass, and Leon Kass did it. So that's where it came. But
you're going to say he asked me. I'm going to write that.
That's next. Yeah. All right. Well, that was during his lifetime, and unlike you, I wasn't alive then. But I have a question about you, since Christopher Brewer.
Very good.
And about the science. So my impression is that Strauss studied a lot of science, like Aristotle's physics and so on, and in the 40s, and he wasn't gearing up to study more science near the end of his life, though there was this planned book on Hume. So maybe I'm wrong about that. It was more like Euripides he was going to turn to. And whereas in the BC Texas school, there's this intense attention to the possibility of science and science. And there's supposed to be philosophy too, but somehow science, and people are doing translations of the Parva Naturalia and so on. And do you understand that as a furthering of Strauss's intention or as a supplementation? Or Eric? Yeah.
Were you asking me?
Yes,
Sure.
I'm asking you.
Supplementation. I mean, I don't know what Strauss studied or didn't study, but if we take our bearings by his writings, I mean, there's just not very much. I mean, there's hardly any attention to Strauss' natural scientific writings. I mean, he does refer to them in notes and things, but one is hard pressed to find treatments, of the natural scientific writings, even from the point of view of political philosophy. That's a little bit puzzling. Why is there not more of a treatment of, say, the question of teleology and Aristotle's physics, precisely from the point of view of a reflection on morality, on ethics? One might have expected him to do that. One doesn't find that in the natural right and history, for example. So it is puzzling. It's not there. So yes, by all means, I think, and I would say that it is fully compatible with his project. I mean, Strauss had only one lifetime. He accomplished so much. He opened up so many avenues. And I think he did see it as his life project, to this recovery of political philosophy as his life project. And but I don't think that he would have been the first to say, and he says in many of his writings, that philosophy is the attempt to replace opinion about the whole with knowledge of the whole. It's about the whole, ultimately. It's about nature, understanding that. And it's, if we're going to be true to that legacy, to his legacy, we have to be true to that. And we, as followers of Strauss, we, so to speak, stand on the shoulders of a giant, but we have to try. And it's good that it's happening a little bit.
It's I was just reading What is Political Philosophy with a student. There's that interesting, so in the introduction to Natural Right and History, he raises the question of the relationship between teleology and Aristotle and his account of the human being. And then there's a parallel passage where he addresses the same issue in What is Political Philosophy, and he gives a completely different sort of approach to it. Rather than saying, well, this is huge, we can't even begin. Here he just says, oh, it's just easy in a paragraph. And sometimes you get the feeling with Strauss that, he has an approach, thoughts on the matter, but, for the purposes of his writing and whatever he's trying to accomplish with writing, he can't really address it, but he does give you a sort of way to think about it, right? Which is, I think, creates sort of areas where students or future scholars could start to think about these issues.
Were you referring? I haven't read What is Political Philosophy in a while. The passage where he suggests or meets the objection that classical thought is obsolete or classical political thought is obsolete because of its dependence on an obsolete natural philosophy, namely Aristotelian philosophy.
Cosmology.
Yeah, a cosmology, and then suggest that relation is not properly understood as one of dependence in that way. But one could make that point, and that point is true and correct, and nevertheless insist on the importance of studying natural philosophy, that one doesn't have to accept the false dependence of political philosophy on natural philosophy to doesn't have to accept that. One could accept the point and still add, we need to study.
Absolutely.
He
replaces the cosmology with the quest for cosmology. This is in the last two paragraphs of the section on the classical solution to the political philosophy. And
that could mean different things. I mean, it could mean, you could say that the theological political question, that's one aspect of cosmology, because it's raising the question as to what you could say the highest principle of the whole is. That's fine, and that's an important thing, but that's not all there is to cosmology, obviously. The study of the natural world, that's obviously central.
Can I make someone from the...
Sorry, I've spoken too much. Yeah.
Promote a temporary promotion to panelist. Let's see. Allowed to talk. Okay.
Hello. I just want to add on to what Mr. Peru said about the elliptical manner of Strauss's writing, which disposes of difficult topics in just one or two sentences. And also, I want to tie this to the whole panel discussion of natural theology. In Natural Right and in Natural Right and History, right? Strauss does tackle the question that we have been discussing throughout this panel. What exactly is natural theology in his own understanding? Then he touches on this very important question of Thomas Aquinas, how he differs from Aquinas. The remarkable thing about that treatment is he disposes of that important topic and difficult topic in just a few sentences. He says this very elliptically. Thomas Aquinas has this again notion of theology that seems to presuppose his revealed revelation. But he doesn't go into detail about that. He doesn't explain further what exactly is Thomas's dependence on revelation as opposed to human reason in his presentation of natural theology. So I just want to add how Strauss is so elliptical when it comes to these very theoretical topics. In his main works, he just leaves matters at that, and makes his reader perplexed. Yes. And that's it. Thank you.
Can I ask Marco a question about Strauss and Christianity? Have you spent any time with Ernest Fortin's writing? I think as far as his possible effect on Christianity, there's some very interesting remarks about how he received Strauss's critique of natural law. I had a conversation with Doug Crease about this, and it was pretty fascinating to me. I don't know how much time you spent on it, but it strikes me that at least one of your questions that you raised might be fruitfully engaged in that.
And I mean, another area before you answer, Marco, is Strauss's impact on Jewish thought. I mean, that's something that is maybe a little bit more obvious than his effect on Christian theology. But it's also, I mean, once you look at Strauss's sort of the hard biographical facts of his life, when he was a visiting professor, it was typically at a Jewish institution. The lectures he gave were either sort of about the immediate topics that he was working and writing on, or it was for Jewish institutions, and typically on sort of quote unquote Jewish issue. So he was very much engaged in sort of the American Jewish academic world. I mean, this is also part of what Alex was talking about, sort of the more, Alex was, of course, went to great philosophical depth, and I'm just superficially scraping the surface. But his sort of role as someone who wanted to have and did have an influence on Jewish studies and Jewish quote unquote theology.
Well, thanks. Yes, of course, thanks, Alex, for pointing out Ernest Fortin. I must confess that I plan to read Ernest Fortin's and James Shaw's writings on Strauss, because I guess that is going to be very interesting for my topic, or for the topic of Strauss and Christianity, broadly understood. And of course, what Hannes says is true. I mentioned the case of Emil Fackenheim because there is a book, there is a monograph, there is a study on that, which is quite extensive. But I think that I'm more interested in that, let's say, underground influence that Strauss had on other authors. I mentioned that's a case that I always mention that, but I'm sure, I have a feeling it's not the only one. I mean, Robert Spemann, he mentioned the natural right and history, and he said he read that like it was very like the Bible. So Spemann was a German philosopher and a theologian, sort of a Christian philosopher, and this is what I'm aiming at. So I'm sure that Strauss was taken seriously by Christian thinkers and theologians, even though that's not evident, because also Ratzinger, we know that Joseph Ratzinger mentioned Strauss wrongly. He quoted Levi Strauss, but he meant Leo Strauss. So my question is that possible to find out within the very broad Christian tradition, by which I mean it's not only Catholic Christian tradition, it's broadly understood, some kind of influence of the very arguments that Strauss developed to counter that prejudice in favor of atheism in the modernity. I think they are not trivial arguments. I cannot take for granted that many theologians have thought very refined arguments, because we know there is a lot of modern philosophical influence on modern contemporary theology. Just look around on contemporary theologians, what they say. It's very, I would say that Strauss would criticize them for not being enough, radical enough. So this is interesting, I guess. And I don't know if there is time for a question to all of you on my part, but I do not want to push that too much.
Please do, yeah. There's
Yes.
9 minutes and 37 seconds.
Okay, so just let me try to frame this question. The theological-political problem, which kind of problem is it? I mean, is this a perennial problem which cannot be solved? So it's always open? Or is it a problem that each philosopher, for him or herself, has to be solved personally, not relying on any kind of tradition whatsoever? Because if it's an open alternative, then philosophy is possible exactly because it can be wrong, okay? But on the other hand, if in principle we can solve the theological-political problem, then, as Eric said, sometimes it may be that at a certain point we need to move on. Once we solve that problem, we can then study other topics. So I don't know. This is my question to all of you. Thanks.
I've already spoken a lot on this. Why don't you guys want to go for it?
I shut off my video to avoid the question. I mean, it would be interesting to go through and see what adjectives he uses to describe this problem.
I mean, I think sort of we speak about Eric at the end of his discussion period, I think, made a helpful suggestion. I mean, there are a couple of dimensions of the theologico-political problem, right? Most obviously, the two that Eric mentioned. On the one hand, it's this a kind of an existential dimension, the question that was at the center of Eric's own talk, sort of justifying your own way of life. And the other question is sort of this question of how you ground the investigation of nature if you can't dispose of the possibility of an omnipotent God, or that question. I think there are more questions to that, right? I mean, there's also sort of the theological-political problem has many aspects, but I think at least these two need a response in order to, if philosophy is to be done successfully, and insofar it needs to be solved, but that doesn't mean that the question itself. I mean, Eric made it sound as if, at times he made it sound as if that means sort of we can move on to study other things. I would say it would also allow for the study of similar phenomena or similar problems from a different perspective, from a different philosophy. But I also now see that we have Justin, who raised the question, will definitively answer this question. Hi.
Hey guys, really appreciate the discussion. It's very high level discussion so far. My question has to do with Eric's excellent contribution regarding the inability of natural theology to get itself out of this sort of decisionistic basis and to avoid the problem of a mysterious God. And I wonder how many of you are familiar with this concept that I put in the Q&A of the primacy of truth, which Strauss seems to derive from the divided line on the Republic. And the concept is, pistis, which we think of as faith, but he just normally translates it as either trust or reliance and says that we can't do without it. So he seems to be there asserting in his own name something like the Platonic view, which presupposes a kind of pre-established harmony between the mind and the world. And I'd just like to know, do you think there's a basis for that? Do you think he's Platonic in that sense? And if so, how does that avoid the problem of kind of, remaining on the level of an assumption, such that it would be susceptible to the kind of destructive criticism of Descartes and the rest of the moderns?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if you're interested, to take a look at what Strauss says on these topics in the Wilde review, the review of John Wilde, he has some interesting remarks to make about that. But just maybe to link it to what I talked about and to the Shipwreck issue of 46, you might want to take a look at the end of the Reason and Revelation. The question that rises: what exactly was the problem that Strauss saw at that point, and why these doubts that he seemed to have had earlier in his life sort of reasserted themselves in 46, and what were those doubts? And they appear to have been connected with a reading or rereading of Kierkegaard. And I think at the end of the Reason and Revelation essay is useful there, because Strauss indicates that, and the difficulty seems to be this, that if there is to be you could say a refutation of revelation, there has to be some kind of common ground between the two opponents. They have to agree on something. And in particular, and he suggests there has to be, for a refutation to be possible, there has to be some claim to knowledge being made, especially on the part of revelation, right? That something. In other words, that faith is not simply to believe, just to say, I believe, and I'm not claiming I know this, I just believe it. And he seems to have been unsettled by Kierkegaard's apparent suggestion that faith can be just that, faith, without making any claim to knowledge. And that if this is true, then revelation really, there's no common ground in knowledge on which a debate could take place between philosophy and revelation. And therefore, revelation is beyond the scope of refutation. And that seems to, I don't think that he left it at that. I think ultimately he rejected Kierkegaard's radical position. But I think that's really what's at stake there. That's the issue there. And hence, I think the importance, to link it to my presentation, the importance of Strauss wanting to assert that the religious position makes a claim to knowledge of morality, of the law, that it somehow claims to know that, and therefore that a conversation is in principle possible between philosophy and revelation on that ground. Who understands morality better? Who knows what the moral law is better? And so that's that. So, but you're right. Otherwise, it's just an assumption, and an assumption is just that. It doesn't have a claim to. Yeah.
I don't know, Justin, if you want to respond, but there's just sort of an immediate response that I have to sort of this, because I mean, if we take that Shipwreck seriously, and I think we should, there's also sort of two questions arise. Sort of, if you, I mean, an obvious response to someone who sort of says, my inner experience, the kind of revelation, the kind of faith I have makes no knowledge claim. It's sort of, the question is, does it still raise a truth claim, right? How intersubjective is it at the end of the day? And I think if it doesn't do that, then at some point, one of the problems doesn't pose itself. With the one aspect of the theological-political problem isn't as clear. Sort of, it's not as much of a challenge to the philosopher as an existential problem. On the other hand, if we take that seriously as a potential sort of way of grounding faith, the direct investigation of religious experiences, the direct investigation of religious experiences becomes very important. And I mean, since you, I take it, feel at home at BC and at UT as a Strauss scholar, why is the investigation of religious experiences not more part of Strauss study, right? Why do Straussians typically not engage with theologians? Why is there not more of a intense study of Kierkegaard? Why don't people write about Jacobi? You know, like, why is this not more part of the people who share your approach? Why study Xenophon's Oeconomicus if this is the core question, and not modern theologians who give more explicit accounts of religious experiences and how they ground their faith?
Yeah. Well, you're going to BC now, so you're going to change all that. Yeah.
You're going to synthesize everything. Yeah. Jacobi is a good direction. This the introduction to the collected works is unbelievable. Like this 20, 30 page from 1815 or so. Okay, I think we're in negative territory.
Yeah.
So, and we've already and I hope we can have more of these discussions. I think that'll be welcome.
Thank you. We should thank our audience. This is
long-suffering
they have
audience.
shown, Hannes, they have shown German fortitude in sitting in front of their screens for 3 hours and more or less remaining.
Who knows what they were doing? You know, we don't know.
Assuming they were there, yeah. But we should thank them as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Silent but present.
Thank all of you. This was fantastic. Yeah. Many thanks.
Very nice to meet all of you. And so, okay, so we just go now to our